All right. Thanks, everyone, so much for tuning in. Hello, friends. My name is Jed, the Flying Spaghetti Auditor. Today, I'm joined by Dave from Faith Because of Reason. Today, we're discussing the resurrection of Jesus, amongst other things, perhaps. Whether Jesus rose from the dead is going to be our primary topic for today's debate. How are you doing today, Dave?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on, Jed.
Of course. Now, I did take a peek at your channel. You've got a really impressive amount of content. I saw one video that was over 6 hours on this particular topic.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily known for being the most briefly spoken person.
Well, right on. It's definitely as someone who makes content myself, I definitely have a lot of appreciation for the amount of work that you put into your stuff. Well, that's great. So if you're well, I guess before we dive into the meat and potatoes of our discussion, do you want to just give us a quick rundown of like your denomination, history with Christianity, anything you think is relevant to the discussion at hand?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I probably have some similarities actually with your own story because we both were, as I understand your story, raised in fairly conservative, young earth creationist, fundamentalist backgrounds. My father, in fact, is a pastor in the Independent Fundamental Baptist, so I was definitely raised young earth creationist as you were. Came to question a lot of things and reject a lot of things, including, among other things, young earth creationism. But obviously where I departed from you is where I did come to the place where I thought that there were decently good reasons for believing that Christianity was true. And so, of course, that's why I'm still a Christian today. As far as my denomination, I'm a Free Will Baptist, but I'm not sure if that'll be relevant to our conversation at all.
Sure. So as someone who is not a young earth creationist, I take it that to mean you don't think the entire Bible is the inerrant word of God.
So I actually do, but I don't necessarily think everything in the Bible is literal. And also, I don't think inerrancy is going to feature into the case that I'm making today. So none of the arguments I make would depend on that. In fact, if I were to give up my belief in biblical inspiration or inerrancy, I don't think it would actually change a whole lot about my Christian beliefs. But yeah, as it happens, I just don't think that the Bible even supports a young earth creationist view. But that's probably a conversation for another day.
Sure. And yeah, that's one I'd definitely be willing to have some other time. So for today's discussion regarding Jesus's resurrection, I'm no biblical scholar. I'm no expert on New Testament theology. I'm just a guy who's not convinced anyone has ever risen from the dead. And you are. So I was thinking maybe the way we could go about this is you just start presenting your case for why you think Jesus resurrected, and then I'll interject anytime I have a question or a point of disagreement, and then we can go from there.
Sure. And I mean, I can summarize the case relatively succinctly, but obviously, if you have a question for clarification or anything like that, obviously feel free to jump in. So where I begin is with the...
Dave, you froze just as you were about to start speaking.
Sorry,
dear.
Am I still frozen?
No, you're good now.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, you're good.
Okay. So I start with the four canonical Gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And again, I don't presuppose that they are inspired or inerrant or anything like that, but just sort of taking them for what they say, right? They present themselves as straightforward historical reports about the life, death, ministry, and resurrection of Jesus. So we can principally assess those the same way we would any other historical document, right? And so when we do that, my own judgment is that they come up pretty well by these standards. One initial question, and I'm sure this will be a point of disagreement between the two of us, is where's the information coming from, right? So I think that the evidence is pretty good that they're written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as they are traditionally believed to have been. I'm sure we'll dive into that later because I know you wouldn't accept that, and that's fine. I'm happy to defend that. But given that the information in the Gospels does go back to the original eyewitnesses, then basically we have three options. So either what they're telling us is true, they're lying, or they're honestly mistaken in some way. That kind of exhausts the logical possibilities. So against the idea that they're lying, I would appeal to the idea that they face fairly extensive persecution under Nero and the Romans, and even earlier from other Jews, several of the apostles. I think there's good evidence that they were martyred for their belief. And so together, this doesn't look very plausible that they are going to be lying. So then, against the idea that they're honestly mistaken, I just sort of look at the content in the Gospels, right? What are they saying happened? What are they telling us about the resurrected Jesus, right? That they see him, that they touched him, that they were with him for 40 days, that they ate with him, and so on and so forth. These are the sorts of things it's really difficult to be honestly mistaken about, right? Hallucinations are not going to be a really good explanation here. Most of the other naturalistic explanations are just clearly don't have the adequacy to explain that. So if they're not lying and they're not honestly mistaken, that leaves us with the third option, that what they're telling us is true. And so that, in a nutshell, is what my argument for the resurrection of Jesus looks like.
Gotcha. Yeah, and you definitely hit the nail on the head where we're going to disagree about the gospel's authorship. And I was assuming we would spend a good amount of time talking specifically about this point. So my position is that the four gospels are completely anonymous. We have no idea who wrote any of the four gospels. The first time that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were attached to these documents was in 185 AD by Irenaeus. And prior to that, there were many church fathers. I've got 9 examples of early church fathers referencing the Gospels between the years 120 and 185, but they made no mention of Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. So for existence, Didicki, I think I'm saying that name right, refers to the Gospel of Matthew as the Gospel of the Lord. So he's referencing this book, and he's closer to the actual event, but before the name got attached to the book, no one had any idea who wrote it. And then it's only after Irenaeus just claimed that he knew who the authors were that everyone else just started following suit.
Yeah, that's a pretty standard overview of kind of the consensus might be too strong, but at any rate, prevailing scholarly view that the four canonical gospels were originally anonymous. The idea is it begins with Irenaeus, 170s to 180s in there somewhere, and that nobody before this time knows the name of them. So, I mean, one big challenge for this right off the bat, I think, is going to be a church father by the name of Papias of Hierapolis, who's, if we go with standard dating, he's probably 120s. I actually think he can be dated earlier to, even perhaps as early as like the very late 1st century. But Papias of Hierapolis pretty uncontroversially names at least Matthew and Mark as the authors of their gospels. And I think that there's good reasons to think that he identifies Luke and John as the authors of their respective gospels as well. But that, I think, is one big problem in the basic anonymity hypothesis, saying that we don't have the names until Irenaeus. There are other problems I can go into first, but first, do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, regarding Papias is how you pronounce his name, right? So my understanding is that this writing from Papias from around 130 AD is a lost book, but we only know about it because Eusebius referenced it in his book from around 300 AD. So this is actually a source from 300 referencing a lost text from 130. And then there's a quote in question regarding Matthew, which is that where is it? So Matthew composed the sayings in Hebrew tongue, and each one interpreted them to the best of his ability. And so this one sentence is where most of the people who claim Matthew's authorship hinge their entire argument.
Yeah, so I do think that the evidence is broader than that. But yes, you're correct that Papias's works have been lost to us, so they don't exist anymore. But he is cited pretty frequently by church fathers, including Irenaeus, for example. And of course, the relevant citations that you're bringing up, those do come from Eusebius, yes. Now, sorry, go ahead.
I was also going to mention that the quote from Papias that Eusebius mentions claims that Matthew is a collection of stories, a collection of sayings, where, as you know, Matthew is actually more of a narrative genre. So it's not necessarily a collection of saying, it's a narrative. And then it's also written in Greek originally and not in Hebrew.
Yeah, so these are two big objections to saying that Papias is, in fact, talking about the canonical Gospel of Matthew. So here's what I would say about that. So with respect to the idea that Papias's term there, logia, is a reference exclusively to sayings, what's interesting is he actually uses the same term when he talks about the Gospel of Mark, right? Except there he defines what he means by the term, and he defines Mark as the logia, which contain what Jesus said and did. So for Papias, he doesn't equate logia exclusively with sayings. He includes narrative in there, right? He includes it as what they said and did. So that's, I think, one objection to thinking that when he says logia, he's thinking that Matthew is exclusively talking about sayings, because he uses the exact same term in reference to Mark, where it's clearly including narrative. As far as the bit about it being written in Hebrew, so there's an interesting argument from scholars like Bernard Orchard and Kurtzinger and Gundry, who have argued that the term that Papias uses here, that's typically translated as Hebrew language, it's dialecto, right? It's where our English word dialect comes from it. And basically what it's saying is that, or what they propose that Papias is saying, is that he could be saying that the Matthew is written in the Hebrew dialect, right? Or in Hebrew style, something like that. So it doesn't actually have to be taken as written in the Hebrew language. That is a possible interpretation, but another possible interpretation would be that it's written in just a style that's amicable to the Jews. And we can kind of see that even in our canonical Gospel of Matthew, right? It's pretty widely acknowledged that the canonical Gospel of Matthew has a substantially Jewish Christian audience. This is why he's got such like a strong emphasis on Jesus's fulfillment of ancient biblical prophecies and things. So what Papias says there, if it's understood as written in a Hebrew dialect or style, that actually comports pretty well with what we find in our Greek Gospel of Matthew.
Yeah, I suppose that, to me, that just seems kind of, I mean, I'll admit I'm no expert on any of these ancient languages, but to say that it's Greek, but it's in the style of Hebrew, where Matthew actually spoke Aramaic, I mean, to me, it just seems like a total mess. I mean, would we ever say that this is a Spanish document, but is written like French? I mean, to me, that doesn't make any sense.
Well, if it's a Spanish audience say it's a Spanish document, but it's written to, say, people who are from like a French background, right? And it has specific concerns for French people. I think we could say that. That doesn't seem, completely out of the blue to me. Admittedly, like, we don't have the full context of the statement from Papias, so it's a little bit hard to know exactly why he would frame it that way. But it doesn't seem to me that it's like super hard to think of a plausible scenario in which you would say something like that.
I want to go back to the I want to come back to the language thing here in a second, but before we move too far past Papias, one thing that Papias describes in his document is Judas's death, which is in complete contradiction to the other two accounts we have from Matthew and from Acts, which a lot of scholars think was written by the same author as Luke. So we have three different accounts of Judas's death, and the one described by Papias is the most outlandish of all three, where Judas didn't die in a field, he didn't trip and fall, he didn't hang himself, but instead he got some disease which made him balloon out like a circus balloon, and then he started spewing worms from his genitals. And I mean, it was a really, really bizarre and gruesome depiction. And if we're going to take Matthew as canonical or accurate, then we have to reject at least Papias's description of Judas, so that it puts a little bit of a damper on the credibility of at least one, Papias or Matthew or Acts, or perhaps all three.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting fragment, the one that you're bringing up about where Papias allegedly describes the death of Judas. And what's interesting is that it turns up in Kramer's Cantia, and it turns up twice in that work, and it's not the same in both passages. So it's a little bit disputed how much of this actually goes back to Papias, because Kramer's Cantia refers this fragment to us in two different places, and the two are contradicting themselves. So there's some concern about how credible the fragment is in the first place, and how much of it or whether at all it even goes back to Papias. So there is already a textual concern there. But let's put that to one side. Let's say that the highly exaggerated description of the death of Judas does in fact go back to Papias in its entirety. The argument that I would understand you to be making is that this sort of casts doubt on Papias's historical reliability, something
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And so I think what I want to say there is that Papias is kind of a conduit to us, right? He just sort of is transferring information to us. So I'm not specifically relying on Papias's own like credibility as a source here. I just need him to be relaying older traditions. And so when it comes to the specific traditions about the canonical gospels, he tells us where this is coming from, right? He says that he's getting this from a John the Elder, which I would be happy to argue, although maybe this would be for another day, but I would be happy to argue that that's actually John the Apostle that he's talking about there. So as long as he, can be relied upon to relay these earlier traditions, then Papias's own like critical thinking skills about what he passes along, that doesn't actually have to concern us, because wherever he's getting this information about Judas from, he's passing that along, presumably from a different source than from John the Elder. So as long as we can rely on John the Elder, that's ultimately the source that we're relying on. It's just coming to us through Papias. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I think what you said does make sense, but I don't think that we can. I'm not convinced that Papias is an accurate source, because if he's relaying information that we are confident is not true, then for all we know, his sources are bogus. And so who he thinks, or who you think is John the Apostle could be a different John. It's a common name from back then. So who knows who his sources are? Who knows if Papias is just making stuff up too? I mean, he could be embellishing the stories on his own. And with regards to Judas's death, that seems to be one particular story where embellishment seems to be growing exponentially every time that the story gets retold, where, we have this hated character who everyone wants to suffer this big demise, so that people just make up a story to make themselves feel better.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be that possibility with any historical source, right? What if they're making it up, right? Generally, I suppose we'd want specific information that it's being made up. In the case of Papias, he doesn't look like the kind of guy who's making stuff up. He looks like he's the kind of guy who's passing on other stuff to us, since in, again, the few quotations that we have from him, that is what he does. So, similarly, I would say that the Judas story, assuming it is original to him in the first place, there's not necessarily any reason to suspect that he'd be the one who made that up. It really could have been anyone in earlier church tradition, and then it's just preserved through Papias. That would tend to be what I suspect is going on. But maybe zooming out just a bit, could you at least see why this would be a reason to question the idea that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John aren't attributed to the Gospels up until the time of Irenaeus, that we have these names turning up earlier? Do you at least see that as putting some questions on the anonymity hypothesis?
I mean, it definitely raises some controversy, sure, because now we have a source from 300 citing a source from 130, which, if we just accept that Papias's claims from 130 are legitimate, then that's the earliest record we have of someone claiming the Gospel's authorship. But even 130 is still years after the events took place, 100 years after Jesus's death. So, we're still pretty far removed from the actual events.
That's fair. I think that Papias actually dates probably to more like 110s, if not like late 90s. And I mean, I have my reasons for that. We don't necessarily have to get into that, but I guess my point here would be we are pushing it back significantly earlier than the 170s and 80s by the time of Irenaeus. And again, Papias tells us that this information is coming to him even earlier from an elder John. So, I mean, I do think that this is definitely going to push us to the first century that these names are known. That would be my conclusion on it. And again, we can move on from here if you like, because I know things get technical fast in this area.
Sure, that's fine. I did want to talk more about the language of the gospel. So all my understanding is that all four gospels are written in Greek, but the disciples spoke Aramaic, and we also have relatively good reason to think that at least two, if not all of them, were illiterate. There's a good case to be made that Matthew and John in particular were illiterate, and these were the only two apostles, or the only two supposed authors who actually met Jesus. Matthew was a tax collector, which is a job that did not require literacy at the time. It was more of an enforcer type role, where you're going out and saying, give me your money. It's not like they're sitting down with a tax book and a checkbook and writing stuff down. And then John, of course, was a fisherman. another career that doesn't require literacy, which was also my understanding at this place and time. Literacy rates were extremely low. And I think I heard somewhere there was a 97% illiteracy rate amongst, this area at this time.
Yeah, so literacy rates were certainly lower at that time. There's no question about that. As far as the specific authors of the Gospels, this doesn't need to be a problem for Mark or for Luke, right? Luke in particular, right, is probably a Greek person anyway, so that he would be writing in Greek. And he's also someone who, according to tradition, is a medical doctor. So that Luke would know how to write, that's not all that surprising in Greek. As for Matthew, there are scholars who will defend the idea that actually he would have had to know how to write in Greek as part of his job as a tax collector. Even if you think it's not strictly necessary, there's not anything like particularly impossible or implausible that a tax collector would, in certain ways, know how to write. Now, as for Mark, the tradition tells us that he's writing for Peter. So there's a decent case that Peter is illiterate. I mean, the book of Acts even says that Peter is illiterate, right? So in some ways, maybe that makes sense, right? That Mark is writing for Peter because Peter can't write himself. And so that kind of leaves us with some question marks surrounding John, right? So here's a couple things that we can float about that, right? One of the things with respect to John would be, it is, of course, just straightforwardly possible if he's writing in the 90s, he could have learned to write between the 30s and the 90s, right? There's a good space of time in there, so there certainly would be opportunity for him to learn how. But if we pay attention to the specific tradition, we actually have tradition telling us that John used a scribe to write his gospel. In particular, they even name Papias as being the scribe who writes for John. I think there are internal factors to the Gospel of John that suggest that that's actually correct. But whether you think that that's the correct story or not, it seems like there are some pretty evident ways to get. Oh, well, and another thing I'll note is that we just know that Paul, right, for a lot of Paul's letters, Paul was using a scribe. He directly says that in some of his letters. So it wasn't like unheard of that people would use a scribe to write for them at this time. So those are some of my thoughts on the general issue you're raising.
Sure. And I want to touch on Luke for a second, too, just to cast some doubt on the idea that doctors necessarily had to be literate. So at that time, doctors weren't writing copious medical notes. So the necessity that a doctor did know how to read and write was lower than it is now. So I would say that it's not impossible that a doctor at the time was proficient in Greek writing, but it's also, I would argue, not necessarily a given that Luke was a scribe or had knowledge of on arithmetic, or sorry, on writing.
Yeah, and so I think I could agree that maybe like a doctor doesn't have to know that. I think I was just saying that it's not terribly implausible. And actually, and I forget the name of the specific work, but a friend of mine, Dr. Stephen Boyce, he argues that Luke's prologue to his gospel is actually sort of using as a template the introduction to like one of the major medical works in Greek medicine of that time. Unfortunately, the name of the specific work is escaping me right now. But that further, I think, does support the idea that the Gospel of Luke is written by someone who is at least familiar with sort of the medical writings of his day.
Another, that's a good point. I don't mean to brush past it, but another point that I want to bring up too is how none of the Gospels use first-person pronouns, except for, I think, Luke in some situations. But Matthew, for example, speaks in third person about Matthew. John refers to a disciple whom Jesus loved, which some people think is John, but not everyone's convinced that's the case. But of course, there's no definitive proof that the disciple whom Jesus loved is John. But nevertheless, John and Matthew still refer to the characters John and Matthew in the third person within their own stories.
Yeah, and the point I would like to raise here is that this is actually not that uncommon in ancient literature of this time. For example, in his work, The Conquest of Gaul, written by Julius Caesar, pretty much no one disputes that. And it's all entirely written in third person, right? Caesar refers to himself in third person during that work. throughout that work, rather. I believe we have similar examples of this in, I'm trying to remember, in Thucydides and also in Plutarch. That's who I'm trying to think of. So these authors also don't, name themselves in their works. Even if they reference themselves, it's third person. It's not to say that everyone did that, because obviously we have Roman historians who did refer to themselves in the first person as well. But it's just to point out that this is not really unheard of for that time. We have plenty of examples of Roman historians who likewise will refer to themselves in the third person. So this doesn't have to be an objection, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's fair. And of course, we could say that it's not a point either way, because of course there's Paul who does refer to himself in the first person. Now, in the book of Matthew copies the story of Matthew meeting Jesus almost word for word from Mark, who wasn't there at the time. So, and Mark, as you know, is an earlier gospel than Matthew. So if Matthew is the one writing Matthew and he's writing about his own meeting with Jesus, why would he need to copy it almost verbatim from someone else?
Yeah, very interesting question. So this is actually another point of disagreement between me and sort of contemporary biblical scholarship, is that I actually don't think that the Gospel of Mark is earlier than the Gospel of Matthew. I actually think it's inverted the other way around. So I think Matthew and Luke are earlier and that Mark is third, and that's sort of the way that biblical scholars tend to approach it, where they so I think they're right that Mark is in some way the middle term between Matthew and Luke, but whereas they think that it's Matthew and Luke drawing from Mark. And again, this is huge conversation, so we don't have to get bogged down here, but I think you can actually view it equally well the other way around, and that you can view this as Mark pulling from Matthew and Luke. So that's my short answer to that, is I just don't agree with the thesis of Mark in priority in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, at that point, you'd be divorcing yourself from the majority of scholarship. But I mean, of course, you're free to do that. And, who am I to object? But, nevertheless, if we do invert it, then we have Mark copying stories from Matthew, which is equally problematic, because that means that Mark is not relaying the story of Matthew meeting Jesus as an eyewitness. And I suppose even if Mark did come first, he's still not an eyewitness to that particular event. So we have, even if we assume that Mark wrote Mark, he's still writing about situations where he wasn't present and he wasn't even there.
I guess I'm not sure if that's an objection, because even if we grant that Mark's the author, as you pointed out, he's not going to be an eyewitness. I mean, Papias, in fact, interestingly, even directly says this. He says that, Mark neither heard the Lord nor followed him, right? But instead he's writing for Peter. So, however you cut that up, Mark is not going to be an eyewitness either way, and neither is Luke, for that matter. So right. I would just own that. What I would say in their defense is that the tradition is very strong that Mark is writing on behalf of the Apostle Peter. So we're kind of one removed from an eyewitness. And that Luke, in his prologue, directly says that he is getting his information from eyewitnesses. He doesn't tell us exactly who they are, but if we accept that Luke knows the Gospel of Matthew, I realize that's not granted across the board, but there's certainly a decent number of scholars who think that Luke knows the Gospel of Matthew. Then I would say we know that, at least in the one source that we can confirm that he's using, that it is an eyewitness. Of course, assuming, I can make the case that Matthew is the author of the Gospel of Matthew. So that's kind of what I have to say there. I agree with you. Luke and Mark are not directly eyewitnesses themselves, but I think there's evidence that they are getting their information from people who are.
Yeah, sure. And I would agree with that. Yeah. Matthew and John are the only two who actually met Jesus, and then Luke and Mark were just companions of Peter and Paul. But of course, I think we may not ever be able to get past the disagreement we have about the Gospel's authorship, where I think there's insufficient evidence to conclude that these four Gospels are written by those four authors, but you are convinced. So where do you want to go from there?
That's fair. Could I maybe see, do you think it's at least the case I've made is not it's not completely ridiculous and unreasonable, though, that a person doesn't have to be maybe totally illiterate of the case here to believe that the Gospels are written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John?
Well, sure. I would concede that it may be possible that those people are the authors, but I just think that we have no good reason to assign those particular books to those authors. Luke in particular, I know Luke's authorship, a lot of people speculate, is kind of just a guess in the hat, where Paul has these 3 or 4 companions. Luke is one of them, and people just say, oh, Luke probably wrote Luke. But, it could be anyone. So, or it could be any one of these other companions of Paul. So, yeah, I'm just not convinced that these authors wrote those books. I don't think there's sufficient evidence to believe so. And the scholarship or consensus seems to be on my side, that there's insufficient reason to warrant belief that these are definitely the authors. But of course, it's not impossible that they are the authors.
Yeah, I guess I was saying, not do you think it's just possible? I was trying to get a little bit more there. I was trying to say, do you think a person could be reasonable in believing that, roughly on the grounds that I offered? But that's fine. We can move on from there. And you are right, by the way. The majority of biblical scholars would agree with you. I'm not sure if we're quite at consensus, because I mean there's a respectable number who do defend the traditional ascriptions of authorship, but certainly a clear majority do agree with you on that. I've listened to some of your other conversations on this topic, and it seems one of your difficulties with believing in something like the resurrection of Jesus comes from miracles, the fact that it would be a miracle. And what I've heard you say on this is that it would violate your understanding of reality or something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. So anytime I read a story from, 2000 years or so ago, like from, Papias talking about Judas's, spewing whatever out of his, what, or, whatever, people slaying dragons, all these really fanciful stories that include elements of what I would consider magic or supernatural elements. These are things that I am not willing to accept based on strictly testimony or claims alone. So generally with most claims, if they're mundane enough that, I could concede that it's possible, I'm just happy to accept it without much extra evidence. So sure, it's possible that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are the authors, but is it possible that a man rose from the dead and then all the dead people in Jerusalem climbed out of their graves and walked the streets of Jerusalem? I'm less convinced that that's the case, because it violates how I understand the world to operate. So I would have to see additional evidence in addition to just the claims in order to accept that.
And specifically, what about your understanding of the way the world works is that violating?
Well, once someone's dead, we have no examples of anyone ever coming back from the dead. And I understand that, that's the whole point. If it's a miracle, this is what Christianity's founded on, we would expect it to violate how we understand the world to operate. That's what makes it a miracle in the first place. So, I can understand why you would think that's not necessarily a good reason to, fold my arms and say it's impossible, I'm never going to believe it, because the whole point is that it is a miracle. But at the same time, I'm not willing to accept a miracle claim based on strictly testimony and claims alone.
Okay, then let's drill down on that a little bit, because I don't think my argument, at any rate, is asking you to accept it solely based on the fact that people are saying it. I'm pairing that with sort of other considerations, right? I'm trying to divvy up the sort of logical space here and be like, well, if people are saying it, what are the possible options, right? They can be telling the truth, they can be lying, or they can be honestly mistaken in some way. And then I'm pairing that with sort of other reasons to believe that they're not lying and reasons to believe that they're not honestly mistaken. And so it's not, I guess I feel like it's not just a bare appeal to, hey, look, they said it happened. It's they said it happened, plus they looks like they're not lying, plus it would be really hard to be honestly mistaken about this stuff. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And one thing with regards to especially these 4 gospels is that they include a lot of other fanciful stories and magical claims in addition to the resurrection. So the same author who wrote about, the same author who wrote Matthew, who's saying that Jesus rose from the dead, is also claiming that Jesus cast out demons. And we know from, or at least there's no reason to believe that demon possession is actually real. We, in this century have a pretty robust understanding of medical science, and no reasonable doctor is going around declaring or, saying that people are possessed by demons. And we're not doing we're not casting out demons in hospitals. We recognize that a lot of these ailments people used to attribute to demons are actually caused from, mental disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, or multiple personality disorder. So we have better understandings of a lot of these diseases and mental disorders that people might have previously attributed to demons, which I only bring up just to cast doubt on these authors, because if they are either lying or mistaken about this thing, then who's to say that they're not lying or mistaken about Jesus's resurrection?
Right. And so I think that's when the appeal to their willingness to die for the resurrection on the one hand, and then the, sheer unlikelihood that you could be mistaken about, eating with Jesus, spending 40 days with him, touching him, and so on and so forth, that you could be honestly mistaken about these sorts of things. That's where that part of the argument is doing work.
Sure, and that'd be a great time to transition into the martyrdom of the disciples and apostles. So my understanding is that, and there's, for all the apostles, I'm not going to claim to be an expert on how each of them have been described to have died, but my understanding is that the information and evidence we have to suggest that they actually did go around preaching about God were held, at for lack of a better term, gunpoint, like, hey, you need to deny God and then or deny Jesus and then you'll live. And if not, we're going to kill you. And then they said, I refuse to deny Jesus. And then they were killed in some brutal way. The evidence that actually happened, my understanding is it's actually pretty minimal.
Yeah. So I think it's going to depend on who exactly we're talking about, right? So if we're talking in most, let me grant you this. In the case of most of the apostles, the sort of legends that we have about how they are said to have martyred, they're late. They're pretty obviously legendary. I would not hang my hat on those. I think we do have pretty good evidence in the case of Peter and Paul that they were martyred. We have this stated, for example, in First Clement, which is pretty undeniably first century. A kind of, if we go with standard dating, it would probably go in like 96 AD, although there are some people who push it back into the 60s. But, it's not that long after the Neronian persecution in 64 AD. So I think we do have pretty good evidence that the two of them were. The more important point that I would want to raise is that I don't think it's actually important that they all specifically, had to have been martyred for this. What's important to me is that we've got a context of persecution, which, we have obviously in the Neronian persecution, where people are persecuted for being Christians. And then even earlier than that by the Jews, right? We have Paul's admission that he himself was a persecutor of Christians prior to his conversion. So we've got pretty good evidence that there's this context of persecution and that the disciples maintained a willingness to stick to their story in the face of that. So even if we can't establish that like all of them actually did end up getting martyred for this, I think we can do that in the case of Peter and Paul. I wouldn't push it any further than that, but I think we can have pretty good evidence that I did a video on this. I think I came up with seven of the 12 apostles. We've got pretty good evidence that they stayed faithful through the persecution.
Yeah, I don't know as if I would accept 7, but two. I've heard between 2 and 4 is a lot more reasonable. That's where more there's more evidence to suggest that. And of course, I'm definitely more willing to accept claims made from the 1st and 2nd century than I am, say, the 9th century. Which I think the legend where we hear about the apostles being crucified upside down and all these kinds of horrific things, those come from much later, like you said, where it's more like scholars are filling in the gaps of our knowledge, with what they want to be the case rather than what they actually have evidence for. So I'm glad that you're not asserting anything more than Paul and Peter or Simon Peter. So I'm generally fine with accepting those. One quick tidbit: you mentioned First Clement, which I also want to briefly point out is also one of the 9 examples I had of early church fathers referencing the Gospels anonymously. So First Clement doesn't recognize the gospel authorship. Just wanted to throw that out there. But with regards to the martyrdom of the apostles, and even if I were to grant all 12, I'm not convinced, and I don't think anyone should be, that someone's strength in a particular belief or their willingness to die for it is evidence that that belief is true. Would you agree with that?
2 points. First of all, on the bit about them referencing these texts anonymously, the counter to that is that it's not that. So there's a distinction between referencing a text and not naming the author, and then referencing it anonymously, as in saying that the author is unknown. The church fathers clearly reference the book of Hebrews anonymously, right? They say, like, we don't know who wrote this. We have no examples of that with the Gospels. We do have examples of them, citing, quoting the Gospels without giving specific name attributions. But we have examples of that in Papias and in Irenaeus as well, where they quote the Gospels and don't give names to them. Yet, obviously, nobody thinks that Papias or Irenaeus thought that the Gospels were anonymous. So, sorry, not to bring us back to that, but
Sure, yeah, that's fair. And I brought it back up, but I would say that while I think it is actually a strong case that if some of these early church fathers are referencing these books without mentioning the name of the book or the author, to me, it's like, why on earth would you do that? No one who's alive now referencing the Gospels would ever fail to mention which one they're talking about, or no one would ever cite Matthew as the Gospel of the Lord, or call them memoirs of the apostles instead of just calling them Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And of course, to me, that's a strong indication that they didn't have those names attached to the Gospels at the time. But we don't, like you said, we don't have to get back into that.
Yeah, I think we do have examples of that. And you brought up Justin Martyr, and there's so much I want to say on Justin Martyr, referencing these as the memoirs of the apostles, specifically even identifying Peter as the source of Mark. But yeah, we'll move on.
Sure.
Can somebody die for a lie? Well, obviously the answer is yes, right? So now I think you said that you don't think it's evidence at all that a person, that what they're saying is true. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say that yeah, exactly. I would say that it's not evidence at all that someone's belief is actually true. So one quick example would be like Jonestown, where, there was the biggest mass self-unaliving of, history. And we have all these people drinking the Kool-Aid because they're genuinely convinced and mistaken that if they do so, they're going to go to heaven with Jim Jones. And all those people, I think both of us would agree, are solely and horribly mistaken and misguided. So people could genuinely be fooled by a lie where they're not lying themselves, but they're just genuinely mistaken and they're willing to die for it.
So what you bring up there is the other half of what I'd say is that it's not sufficient evidence without also being paired with good reasons to think that the person is not being honestly mistaken. So I would agree it's not sufficient evidence in and of itself. I don't know what I would want to say that it's no evidence, because it is, taking up a significant part of the probability space off the table. And the reason for that is because I think a willingness to die is very good evidence for one's sincerity. I think that the people who, drank the Kool-Aid, they did so because they genuinely believed, right? People who, fly airplanes into buildings, right? And then lose their own life in the process. I think they do that because they genuinely believe. And so similarly, what I use the willingness of the apostles to die to support is the thesis that they are genuine in their belief. And one other point to make here, I suppose, would be that there's a significant disanalogy between the apostles and most modern people who demonstrate a willingness to die for their religious beliefs. And that's going to be that the apostles are the people with whom the belief originated, right? So they're not believing this on the basis of someone else's say-so, like perhaps like a Muslim suicide bomber or like, a cultist who decides to drink the Kool-Aid. They're just taking someone else's word for it. Whereas with the apostles, it's based on their own experience. So I see that as an important difference.
Yeah, that's a fair difference. And I think you said something earlier that the fact that someone's willing to die for something on its own is not sufficient to believe it's the case, but rather the fact that they are not mistaken is a good reason to believe that their case is true. And I think that to me, that almost seems like a tautology. If someone is not mistaken, then of course that everything that they say is true just by definition.
Well, so I was saying not honestly mistaken, right? So I'm ruling out, on the one hand, the possibility that they're lying, right? In which case the person wouldn't be honestly mistaken. They would be, dishonest. And then taking off that they're honestly mistaken. So those are kind of the two ways in which somebody could be giving testimony and it be false. It can be intentionally false or unintentionally false. And so I'm using the martyrdom of the apostles to sort of take that first option off the table, and then I would give other reasons to take that other option off the table. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And yeah, I think that, like I said, I'm just never willing to accept a claim based on the fact that someone's willing to die for it. So, if the apostles died, or if two of the apostles died, is that reason to believe that, and this entire religion is true and Jesus rose from the dead? I'm not convinced that in itself is enough. And it doesn't seem like that's what you're claiming either.
Right. I'm saying it's enough to believe that they're not lying about it. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but I'm not sure if we have sufficient reason to believe that if these people actually died, if these two people, Paul and Simon, actually died in horrific ways, that they died strictly because they refused to admit that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Like how do we know exactly why they died, or were they given a chance to recant?
Do you think they were killed for being Christians, though?
I have no idea.
Okay, so typically the way this is understood is you're familiar with the Neronian persecution, right, of 64 to 68 AD?
Vaguely.
Okay, so according to Tacitus, right, a fire started up in Rome in 64 AD, and people were blaming this on Emperor Nero, and he needed basically somebody to blame this on to get the pressure off of himself. And so Tacitus tells us that he picked the Christians, and so the Christians were killed in all sorts of elaborate ways, basically. And so basically pairing that with some of what Clement tells us in his letter, there's a lot of correspondences between the language of Clement and Tacitus when he describes the deaths of Peter and Paul. Generally, what is believed is that Peter and Paul died during that persecution of the Christians. This is, explicitly stated later on by people like Tertullian. I think it's pretty uncontroversial that Peter and Paul died as a result of that persecution, which was specifically targeted against Christians.
Sure. And amongst those two, the only one who actually met Jesus is Peter, if I'm not mistaken. So we have one person who is actually a witness, supposedly one person who is a witness to Jesus's resurrection, dying for their beliefs. And so, one testimony versus, this miracle claim doesn't seem strong enough to me.
Yeah, so I think this is what I would go back to a point I made earlier, that I don't think it's strictly necessary that they all died. It's necessary that they are willing to die. And so what I want is evidence that they are essentially remaining faithful sort of after persecution breaks out against them. Now, for one thing, we do have evidence that they're being persecuted well before Nero, right, by the Jews. Paul himself will bear witness to that. And then I would just appeal to other contemporary writings, one of them being Papias, for example, that even after the Neronian persecution, we still have 7 of the original 12 who are remaining faithful, despite the fact that they are being persecuted. So that's the broader case I would make against them being liars.
Sure. And, when we have this situation where hundreds or thousands of Christians are being brutally killed as a, way for, you said it was, who was the king at the time to, Nero, to bring blame off of himself. Isn't it possible that Peter and Paul were killed during this time, but then someone writing about their death fabricated the reason that they died was because they, Peter claimed to have seen Jesus, when in reality, Peter was just a Christian who may have believed in a spiritual ascension of Jesus, and that someone later just imbued the story with the idea that Peter was actually claiming that Jesus rose from the dead.
So I would say, based on what we independently know from Tacitus about the reason for the persecution, it's specifically targeted against Christians, right? We know that from the writings of Tacitus, who, he doesn't know Peter, right? He's a secular Roman historian, so he's not going to make that up. So I don't think that there's a real case to be made that they aren't being killed because they are Christians. It might not specifically be because they, are claiming to have witnessed the risen Jesus or something like that. But certainly their belief in the resurrection of Jesus, that's a key claim. That's a key component of their being Christians. So they are at least, being killed for that. I think that's the point that I would make in response to what you're saying there.
Yeah, and I might push back on that. Is it possible that a lot of these early Christians did not believe in a physical resurrection of Jesus, but rather a spiritual resurrection or spiritual ascension, which later became or was later embellished to be a physical resurrection?
It's logically possible in the sense that there's not a strict logical contradiction in that idea. I do not find that to be probable based on the historical evidence. Obviously, there are people who think that Paul has a spiritual doctrine of the resurrection. a lot of this is going to come down to what does he mean in 1 Corinthians 15, right? When he's contrasting the what is sown a physical, well, not sown a fleshly body, right? Raised a spiritual body. I mean, we can go down that rabbit hole if you want, and I can defend why I don't think that Paul believed in a spiritual resurrection. But fundamentally, I make my case from the Gospels. It's clear that the Gospels have a physical understanding of the resurrection, so we don't necessarily have to go down.
Yeah, and well, I would agree that the Gospels, as we have them written now, do portray a story including a physical resurrection. I think that's fair to say. I guess I was only saying, what if prior to the writing of the Gospels, the actual characters, assuming that they're real, that the stories are based on, did not believe in a physical resurrection, but rather a spiritual one?
Yeah, I mean, that'd be obviously, and you're saying like even people like Matthew and John, right? That
Right,
even
yeah.
Yeah, then obviously that would throw a huge wrench in my theory, right? Because then I'm not going to probably be able to depend on the Gospels for that. As it happens, I don't think that that's a problem because I don't think the evidence is there for that.
Now, one interesting route we could go down next, and this is a point I believe I heard from Alex O'Connor, I think, which is that if Jesus was resurrected physically and then literally his body ascended into heaven, what happened after that? So we have a physical body up in the clouds, literally in the clouds. From there, did he magically go into a different dimension? Like, did he manifest away from our reality into a different reality? Was he just up in the clouds for a really long time? Was he still, did he have to trim his beard while he was up there? Like, what's the extent of how long Jesus was actually, in existence in our reality after he resurrected?
Yeah, well, from Luke, which I would happy to defend that Luke is a trustworthy source, but Luke is going to say it's 40 days after the resurrection, between the resurrection Sunday and his ascension into heaven. Now, as to, what happened once he got up into the clouds, I mean, we don't really know. Presumably something like that first scenario you described is what I would assume happened. But the honest answer is I don't really know because I don't have any details about that in Scripture.
Sure. And I bring it up because I think speculating about these kinds of questions are a good way for me to deconstruct the idea. Because if Jesus ascended into the clouds and then disappeared, why didn't he just disappear when he was on the ground? It seemed like he was putting on a big show for everyone there. And the people who at the time presumably believed that heaven literally was up in the clouds. Like if you go up high enough, you reach the kingdom of God, which of course is also the inspiration for like the Tower of Babel story. So it seems like the people who believed that heaven was literally within our reality, within our dimension and just up high, they were the ones also saying that Jesus ascended into heaven because from their point of view, ascension was necessary to get there.
Yeah, I think probably Jesus did it as a symbolic gesture, and it's probably is sort of appealing to, as you said, the fact that this is just a belief that they, and even people today, sort of just intuitively have that, right? God in heaven is up, right? Even though that's not, literally the case. If we want to get into the metaphysics of it, right? It doesn't exist on this plane of the physical plane of reality, if you will. But I think, yeah, it's a symbolic gesture that Jesus was engaging in and probably giving them that last little bit of confirmation that he was sort of returning to the Father, as he said in John 17. So that's more or less what I think is going on there.
Sure. And here's another question. With regards to Paul's Damascus Road experience, the Bible describes Paul's experience as seeing a bright light and hearing a voice. But I've heard some Christians interpret it like Paul literally saw a physical Jesus. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I don't think he's like super clear. I know we have two accounts of it, and I don't think we get like a whole lot of details about what the experience of Jesus is like. There are some arguments about the sort of term that Paul uses for appearance, meaning that he would have seen Jesus sort of physically the way, well, I mean, not exactly the way you and me are seeing each other right now, but like say the screens weren't here and we were in the same room. There are people who argue that Paul's language there does support that he was seeing Jesus in that way. I am not myself persuaded that those arguments are conclusive. Ultimately, to me, I leave it open. It doesn't really matter that much to me what the appearance to Paul exactly was like. because I don't really use Paul's witness when I'm building my own case for the resurrection, just because I think there are, some issues with people who try to rely too heavily on Paul. Paul really doesn't give us a whole lot of experiences or a lot of details about what his own experience of the resurrected Jesus was like. So because of that, it's kind of hard for me to know, was this like, a transparent Jesus, a translucent Jesus who's, rainbow and floating through the sky. I mean, Paul just doesn't give me enough information to know. So that's kind of why I prefer to stick with the Gospels than with Paul.
Yeah, that's fair. And I agree that anyone who tried to use Paul as good evidence for the resurrection would be, doing themselves a disservice, because I think Paul's experience could easily be dismissed as a hallucination. He's having some sort of mental experience that may not even be real. And perhaps he's even lying about the whole thing. Maybe he had no experience and he made it up just to give himself more credibility.
Yeah, I think that there's probably not a super good case that Paul is being deliberately dishonest there, because there's the good evidence that he was one of the people who was martyred. And we have his own testimony, right? Talking about like his own struggles that he went through. So I think it's probably not very plausible that Paul is lying. But to your point, it is going to be a lot harder to rule out Paul being honestly mistaken, for the simple reason that he doesn't give us any details about what his experience of the risen Jesus was like.
Yeah. Here's kind of a separate topic regarding the authenticity of the Gospels and their reliability. Specifically with regards to the resurrection story, I've spotted 6 different contradictions within the resurrection between the 4 Gospels. So I'd be interested to hear how you reconcile some of these, and whether you think that they are legitimate contradictions or can be interpreted in such a way that eliminates a contradiction.
Yeah, we can definitely do that. The first thing I think I'd want to just draw our attention to is that I don't think that all contradictions are equal, right? So the sort of contradictions that would concern me are contradictions that result from like a deliberate change that one gospel author is sort of making to the other, right? Like assuming that Mark is the first gospel, just for the sake of argument. If, Matthew is sort of deliberately changing things, and that suggests that his concerns are not strictly historical, that's going to create bigger problems for my position than, something that could be explained as like a good faith mistake that, you could have within a historical text. So some contradictions aren't necessarily, like, even if they're legitimate, are not going to concern me as much as others. But, having said that, I'm happy to go down the line with you and talk about the specifics.
Sure. And I think that's a reasonable, response from you right away, is that some of these contradictions in the resurrection story, they're only really an issue if you think that each gospel is the actual word of God. And if God was dictating the words of the authors, then we would expect all of them to line up perfectly. And the fact that they don't, to me, is a clear demonstration that the gospels were not influenced by any supernatural intervention, but that, it is presumably still possible that they were written by, what I would consider hearsay based on oral tradition and then written down, decades later. But probably the one, if we want to just stick with one from the resurrection, that I think is the most interesting was Jesus there at the empty tomb? 2 of the Gospels, Matthew and John, claim that he was, but in Mark and Luke, they explicitly say that Jesus was not there.
Yeah, so my view is going to be that he's not there like right away, right? But that he comes back, I believe in John, it's to Mary Magdalene, right? So my view is going to be that he's not there when all of the women are there. What exactly is going on with Mary Magdalene? I mean, there's theories about that she doesn't go with the rest of the women or whatever to tell the disciples, and then Jesus appears to her. Probably something like that is what happens on my view.
So you would say that there were like 5 or more people that went to the tomb and then they left, and then Mary went back and then had her own experience later. And so it sounds like what you're doing is reconciling, say, like the Luke and the John account, where in Luke there were more than 5 people who visited, and then in John there was just Mary Magdalene, but then she left and came back with 2 other men, and then they left, and then she had an appearance from Jesus.
So my view would be, I think that Mary does not go with the other women when they go to tell the disciples. In fact, we don't have to get into that. John Wenham has a theory that Mary actually kind of goes around before the angel turns up, and so she's not even there for the angel. But that's not even required for this. My view would basically be that she doesn't go with the rest of the women to tell the disciples, and that's when Jesus appears to her at that point. And then, presumably after that, she goes off somewhere else, and the rest of the ladies tell the disciples, and that's when we have the 2 disciples come to the tomb. That's more or less my understanding of the chronology there.
Sure. And this reminds me of a bit I heard from Bart Ehrman, who is saying that because all the 4 Gospels disagree with each other about the specifics of the resurrection, apologists are forced to create their own narrative, which is not featured in any of the 4 Gospels, as a method of trying to reconcile all of them.
So 2 points there. One of them is not that they necessarily disagree with each other. It's that they are telling you different, things that are there. In order for them to disagree, they're going to have to genuinely be incompatible. So what the apologist like me is doing in giving you a more, elaborate story than you are going to find in any one of the particular Gospels is that these are not actually disagreements, or at least they don't have to be disagreements. As for that, there's something objectionable about this. I'll admit I've never understood this line from Ehrman. Since when are we not allowed to consult multiple sources to sort of reconstruct what plausibly happened, even though that entire reconstruction is not going to be featured in any one source? I mean, I'm a fan of true crime, right? Me and my wife, we watch a lot of true crime, and it's very common, right, that police will or detectives will interview various different witnesses, and that they will only get part of the story from each of them, and then they have to reconstruct the reality. So there's nothing illegitimate about doing this in historical research, about using different sources to piece together a fuller picture of what happened. So from my perspective, there's not a problem with doing that.
Yeah, that's a great response, actually. The one thing I might claim as a true contradiction within the stories is whether the stone was pre-rolled or not. So in Matthew is the only gospel where the visitors to the tomb see an angel come down from heaven and then move the stone away. They feel the earthquake as it happens, and then the angel sits on the stone afterwards. But in the other 3 gospels, the stone is already rolled away by the time the visitors get there.
Yeah, so this is an interesting one because to basically get to the conclusion that the people, as the women are coming, that they see the stone being rolled away, you have to use sort of maybe a King James version of the Bible, that sort of translation, right? Where it sort of describes it as happening sort of as the women are arriving. And given that translation, right, it definitely is going to look like the stone is being rolled away. A difficulty here, though, with saying that this is definitely a contradiction is that the main verb in the sentence that there was a great earthquake, it's in the aorist indicative. And so basically in Greek, the aorist indicative, it can be translated into an English pluperfect, which basically is describing background events. So to summarize that, the translation I would prefer is something like in the NASB, where it says that Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the tomb, and behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. So basically, that's called a pluperfect translation, when you're saying this had occurred. And so instead of this happening as they're arriving, it's saying they arrived and this had already happened. So that's more or less how I understand the text in Matthew. I prefer the translation, which says that this had already happened when the women arrived.
Sure. And I think that may be plausible, except that if the authors didn't witness the stone being rolled away by the angel, how do they know that the angel is responsible for rolling the stone away? Maybe Jesus rolled the stone away himself.
Yeah, I'll admit I've never quite understood the force of this objection, right? Because presumably the guards at the tomb, right, that Matthew believes are there, he believes that they go and that they tell the Pharisees, right? So whether, obviously we're speculating here, but maybe one of the guards themselves later converted to Christianity and gave this bit of information to Matthew or to one of Matthew's sources. Perhaps one of the servants in the temple with the high priests, when the guards told the high priest what happened, perhaps they overheard it, later converted to Christianity, shared this information with Matthew or one of Matthew's sources. It seems to me that there's all sorts of ways that this could have been known. I guess I've never felt the force of that particular objection.
Sure. And I think, to me, the objection seems like, the reason it seems reasonable is that if we were to discredit the contradiction, it requires us to do some pretty heavy speculation about guards converting to Christianity after the fact, where I think a more reasonable explanation is that somebody just made up a detail that, the stone, who knows how the stone got rolled back, if there was ever a stone at all, but that people were just saying an angel was responsible when really no one knows how it rolled away or if it rolled away, at all. Maybe that this whole bit about the story is entirely fabricated.
Well, so like taken in the abstract, I mean, that would be completely fair, right? I mean, we'd have two possibilities that like maybe there's a way they could have got this information from a guard or from a servant in the temple, or right, maybe Matthew's just making stuff up. I think what I'm doing is I'm approaching it sort of with the background information of sort of my broader ideas of, I have independent arguments, right, that I think that Matthew is a trustworthy historian. So I think I have good evidence that Matthew doesn't just make stuff up like that. So given that background information, that's weighing against the hypothesis that you're putting forward. But I mean, obviously, if you're not considering sort of these background considerations, then there wouldn't be a strong way to tell one way or the other.
Sure. And I also don't want to brush past the fact that accepting the Gospels as true also requires us to believe that angels exist and that there really is, in addition to a man rising from the dead, a host of anthropomorphic superhumans that can go back and forth between different dimensions and glow with bright light, and they have superhuman strength. And sometimes the Bible describes angels as looking like humans, or sometimes they have a billion eyeballs and 10 different wings. Not to say that maybe a being could just transform itself to look more like us, but still want to look a little bit different so that they're intimidating and people are scared. But to me, angels are even more outlandish than the idea of someone rising from the dead. But the belief in angels seems like it's required to accept the resurrection.
Well, I mean, if you're going to accept it, I mean, theoretically, you could accept the resurrection without accepting angels, right? Like if you bought into like the minimal facts argument, right, and you thought you could make the case just on the basis of Paul or something like that, or maybe you just believe it purely on the basis of religious experience, right? God revealed it to you directly or something like that. So there are ways you could believe in the resurrection without believing in angels. But yes, for the type of argument that I'm making, which is based on, robust gospel reliability, that is plausibly going to commit you to the existence of angels. But I mean, in my view, the quality of the evidence for, denying the propositions that they are lying or honestly mistaken is very strong. And so if, as a consequence of having to go with the thesis that they're telling the truth commits me to the existence of angels, because I mean, it's already going to commit me to things like a resurrection and miracles and things like that. So kind of once I've already taken the step there, then, taking the step to that God exists, that angels exist, that's kind of just, that flows from that for me. So I guess I don't see it like as that I'm accepting that much more than I already accept.
Yeah, and to me, it does seem like a really big ask to ask me to accept that a man rose from the dead, that when he was alive, he performed, I don't want to, say ridiculous, but, pretty crazy and outlandish miracles. He's turning liquids into other liquids. He's bringing people back from the dead. He's walking on water. He's flying. He's doing all sorts of crazy stuff. And then also there's a God who created the universe. And then there's millions of angels who are, superhumans, and humans can be possessed by demons, which presumably still happens amongst, a host of other pretty outlandish claims that the New Testament makes, like the existence of heaven and hell. So buying into the authenticity or the reliability of the gospel authors means that you have to accept all these things. And it's It's a demand that I change everything about my worldview based on what I would consider pretty minimalistic claims from a book which I don't have very good evidence to believe is authentic from anyone who was actually there, or is actually even telling the truth if they were there.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, if you judge that the reliability of the Gospels is pretty minimal to non-existent, or that it's not coming from people who are close up to the events and habitually truthful, then yeah, I would understand why you would not be willing to take the step. As it happens, right? I think you'd be wrong if you think that the Gospels are not robustly reliable, or that the information is not coming from people who are close up to the events. Obviously, that's going to return us to some of the issues pertaining to gospel authorship and things like that we've already discussed. But yeah, obviously, if you're not persuaded on those grounds, then obviously I wouldn't expect you to accept other things further down the line, because those sort of follow from earlier points that I've made.
Now, you mentioned if someone bought into the minimalistic argument or the minimal facts argument, they wouldn't necessarily have to accept the existence of angels. What are your thoughts on someone accepting that the resurrection did occur, but they still rejected the idea that a God exists? Do you think there's cohesion within that viewpoint?
I mean, you can do that, right? I mean, it's suggested by philosophers like Larry Shapiro and Raphael Ladouceur and their books on this. They suggest, well, even if you accepted that, well, maybe we wouldn't say resurrection, but even if you accepted that Jesus came back from the dead, maybe this doesn't commit you to the existence of God. I don't know of anyone who actually believes that, and I think that's just straightforwardly the case, that if Jesus rose from the dead, then sort of the best explanation of that is that God raised Jesus from the dead. But it's not like logically impossible. Like, sure, you could believe that Jesus possessed some kind of weird, like, mutated gene that made it such that he was able to, come back from the dead and be the only person to ever do so, or something like that. So it's not a contradictory position to hold. I do think it's a pretty radically implausible position to hold, which is probably why I don't think anyone actually holds it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I would acknowledge that very few, if any, people really believe that Jesus rose from the dead, but God doesn't exist. However, I think that if I were to accept that Jesus did rise from the dead, if I was convinced that there was sufficient evidence, then I would still, or I should say, I would not then be convinced that God is the best explanation. That seems to be a point that a lot of Christians take for granted, that if Jesus rose from the dead, then everything he said is true, then he's really the Son of God, and then God and heaven are real places, where I think, potentially a more naturalistic explanation would be more plausible. Like if Jesus did actually have some mutated gene, or perhaps, the diagnosis that he was dead wasn't sufficient. And I'm not necessarily claiming that Jesus didn't die, as an explanation for the story. I'm just saying that I think it may be more likely that there's some crazy phenomenon other than God's existence that could be the explanation for this event.
Yeah, so let me take that in 2 points, right? So I think that's actually a decent point to raise against something like the minimal facts argument, right? And the reason why is because the minimal facts argument, it basically grants you from the start that, oh, well, the Gospels are basically unreliable, right? Maybe we can use the criteria of authenticity and get a few facts out of there, but like basically they're not going to appeal to the Gospels the way that I will in my argument. And so if you kind of go along with that, then I think that there is a genuine question of how are we supposed to make sense of this, right? Because let's just suppose that Queen Victoria, right, came back to life tomorrow. That's really ambiguous, right? Like, what are we supposed to make out of that? Does it automatically follow that Queen Victoria is God, right? Or that heaven and hell are real, or that, Queen Victoria has divine authority over us? Obviously, none of that follows. And so a problem with the minimal facts argument is that it sort of strips away the context of Jesus's resurrection. And so it is really tough to make a judgment about what exactly should we make of the fact that Jesus rose from the dead if we don't have the necessary background understanding to interpret it. Now, my case for the resurrection, I don't think faces this problem because I am appealing to, or I'm depending on robust gospel reliability. So given that, we have Jesus predicting that he's going to rise from the dead, right? And that this is going to be a vindication of his own claims to be divine. So given that we have this sort of context, that's what I think legitimates the inference to that this is best explained by God raising Jesus from the dead, is because this is specifically predicted as being the sign that Jesus's own divine claims are true. These are the claims that he's specifically crucified for. And so then when he comes back to life, that's best interpreted as God vindicating that what he said was true. What would you make of that sort of argument?
No, I think that's reasonable. You know, what you brought up about like Queen Victoria, if she came back from the dead and we didn't have any further context surrounding the situation, we would not know what to make of it. Whereas with Jesus, there's, you know, if we assume that the Gospels are reliable and telling the truth about what he said and did, the fact that he supposedly predicted his own resurrection and said, I will do this, and that's going to be a sign that I am actually divine. I think that's a better indication that if we were to accept the resurrection, that some of the claims that he made are actually true. But that being said, I still don't accept that the Gospels are necessarily completely accurate in everything, or, you know, most, you know, even a majority of the stuff that they say. Now, here's another question for you. Would you say that the resurrection of Jesus is the primary reason for your belief in God, or do you have additional evidence besides the resurrection that you would posit if someone asked you why you believed?
It's certainly my primary reason for being a Christian. It's also one of my main arguments that I do believe in God. There are some other arguments that I find interesting. I don't claim to be as well read in them, so there's probably going to be some, you know, objections out there in the philosophical literature that I may not have, you know, wrestled with sufficiently. So, but here's some arguments that I find interesting. Would be argument from consciousness, for one, would be one that I find very persuasive. And then I think there's probably something to a version of the contingency argument for theism. Obviously, this gets into, you know, really deep modal metaphysics and stuff that's way above my pay grade. But I certainly have at least a strong intuition that there's probably something to some version of the contingency argument for theism. Probably something along the lines sketched by people like Josh Rasmussen and Alex Pruss. But I don't think I've studied like all the objections to this enough to like really confidently say like, yeah, I think this argument is solid. So that's probably the best answer I could give you there.
Sure. You mentioned an argument from consciousness. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that one?
Sure. So it's going to presuppose a controversial theory of mind known as substance dualism. So substance dualism is the thesis that we have a material body and an immaterial mind or soul. And so given that, I would say theism versus, you know, say the most popular or most plausible type of atheism is going to be something like naturalism. It's just a lot more clear that theism is going to have the explanatory resources to explain immaterial conscious minds, because it asserts that at the foundation of everything, there is an immaterial conscious mind known as God, whereas it's not really clear that naturalism does have those explanatory resources to explain an immaterial mind. And so theism is going to be the better explanation of immaterial minds than physicalism.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, I was just going to agree that, yeah, I think it probably is true that theism has a better explanation for immaterial conscious minds or mind-body dualism, but I completely reject the idea of mind-body dualism. In my perspective, our minds are strictly a function of our physical brain, and there's no examples of a mind existing absent a brain. You know, even if you look at something like a computer program, software relies on hardware in order to exist. So, you know, we can't point to any minds that exist without the existence of a physical brain. And not only that, but manipulation of a physical brain can have huge effects on somebody's consciousness. You know, there's been cases where somebody gets a, you know, metal pipe flown through their brain, they miraculously survive, and then they have a ginormous personality shift afterwards, where they used to be jovial, friendly, and now they're kind of angry and bitter, where they because they suffered this physical physical change to their brain, they also underwent a change their consciousness as well.
Yeah, so I guess 2 points on that would be, sorry, the first point you raised was that, having no examples of immaterial mind apart from it, I mean, it's going to be hard to appeal to an uncontroversial example there, right? Because obviously the minds that we are familiar with and interact with, we know of by means of their being paired to a body. So I'm not sure anything super significant follows from that, but I think the key point to make here is that a mind being paired to a body or to a brain doesn't in any way entail that it is identical to those things. So if there's good reasons for believing that consciousness is an immaterial sort of thing, and necessarily so, then just because all examples that we know of it are paired to a body is not in any way going to indicate that it's identical to the body. And then the other point that you bring up about like the Phineas Gage example, where, the rod gets driven through, and comes out an eye, or no, I guess it came out the top of his head, but it messed up one of his eyes. Most dualists, myself included, are interactionists. So we believe that the mind interacts with the body, right? Like, my mind causes me to pick up my phone right here. But we also believe that So we believe that altering things in the physical part of you can also have an effect on the mental state. So showing that the two interact with each other, that's perfectly expected, predicted, even entailed by interactionist substance dualism. It wouldn't in any way indicate the two are identical with one another. It wouldn't indicate that mental states are somehow physical states. It would just prove that they can be affected by physical states, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it might be the case that mind-body dualism is or potentially is an unfalsifiable position. But I think the fact that we have no examples of minds existing absent brains, and the fact that manipulating brains alters people's consciousness, and that presumably when somebody dies, from everything we can possibly observe, their consciousness also ceases to exist. And we don't have any observation of minds existing after somebody's death.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure what you would expect to be observing, though, right? Because immaterial minds are, by definition, right, they're invisible, immaterial things. So they're not the sorts of things that you're going to be able to observe from, outside of the first person perspective. So I guess I'm not sure that there's anything that's that significant in that observation. I think there are ways to falsify substance dualism. So like one attempt that has been tried is to show that like the idea of an immaterial substance is just straightforwardly incoherent by appeals to like the, philosophical problem of individuation or whatever. I don't think that those arguments are very good, but theoretically, if you could show that the idea is like logically contradictory, that would of course falsify it. Another way of trying to falsify it would be just sort of a straightforward appeal to parsimony. And this is probably similar to what you're doing, is say it's not necessary for anything. Like we can perfectly well explain human consciousness, human behavior. Nothing in neuroscience requires an appeal to an immaterial soul. So basically, if it's not necessary for anything, then
Sorry, Dave, the last couple of words you said, you broke up a little bit. Could you repeat those? Looks like you're kind of frozen. Dave has gone frozen. Maybe Dave's consciousness left his physical brain. Or maybe my consciousness left my brain, and now I exist in some other realm and my conscious experience is totally fake. Who knows? Maybe I'm just a brain in a vat and I think I'm talking to Dave, but I'm really not. And I'm just talking to a fabrication of Dave made up by myself. I don't know if Dave can hear me. And if he's a fabrication of my own mind, then what does it even mean to say he can hear me? Who knows? But I hope that Dave is able to come back soon. It looks like we lost Dave completely. Oh no. But friends, don't worry. Dave is probably going to request to rejoin here any second. Yeah, regarding the whole mind-body dualism, and maybe I'll save this for when Dave comes back, but the fact that there's no positive evidence for a mind existing absent a brain, to me, is a good indication that we have no sufficient reason to believe that it's actually the case. Hey, we got Dave back. Welcome back, Dave. Hello, Dave. Welcome back. Looks like you might have switched from a computer source to a phone. And now you're frozen again. Aw, geez. Dave has gone all frozen. One thing that may happen when you open up the StreamYard link is that if you open it within your email, it might be a little bit more laggy compared to right-clicking the link or copy and pasting the link into a web browser. A web browser generally is more reliable than opening it through email.
All right, I'm just turning my internet off and I'm using my phone data right now because I'm not sure what's up with my internet.
Sure. Yeah. And it looks crystal clear now. So we were just talking about mind-body dualism while you were out. I just mentioned that the fact that we have no positive evidence for minds existing absent brains, to me, is a good indication that we have insufficient reason to warrant belief.
But I guess could I ask what sort of what do you think? What exactly would that look like, right? Having evidence for a mind outside of a brain?
Maybe if we could demonstrate that a mind could, well, I mean, there has to be some sort of infiltration to reality. There has to be some sort of interaction with reality in order for us to demonstrate anything. So if a mind absent a brain was able to manipulate reality, like say, if a ghost could pick up a pen and write on the wall, if we could see objects presumably move on their own, but with good indication that they were actually controlled by a thinking agent, like if a pen was writing words by itself and a pen that you see got picked up and it started writing, oh, here, I'm actually the ghost of your deceased loved one. Why? My name is blah, blah, blah. Here's a bunch of information about myself that only I would know. That might be a good indication that mind-body dualism is possible.
Yeah, I think most mind-body dualists, though, think that the way that interaction occurs is, through a human body. That's typically the way that we think that things are. I mean, if we're theists like me, then we might think that maybe God's mind isn't constrained in that way. But at least when it comes to human minds, I mean, typically that's the way that we think interaction has been set up. So our theory doesn't necessarily predict that you would have that sort of interaction. Again, I think the best argument that you're going to be able to make is just that it's unnecessary for anything. But of course, I'm going to argue that there are great arguments for substance dualism, that there's great reasons to be a substance dualist. They're not going to be, scientific neurological arguments. These are generally going to be purely philosophical arguments based on facts about introspection, identity over time, and whatnot. But that it's on those arguments that the case for substance dualism should be decided, because obviously if they don't succeed, then just appeal to Occam's razor is going to straightforwardly indicate that souls probably don't exist.
Sure. And just to provide an additional example, because you asked how could we demonstrate mind-body dualism, if we were under the assumption that minds can only manifest through human bodies, perhaps if we were somehow able to switch the consciousness between two different people, that might be a good indication that consciousness exists absent a brain. If we were somehow able to separate one person's consciousness from their body and put it into a different body.
Yeah. I mean, I guess there's ways of experimenting with that, with, transplanting brains and whatnot, but but
in that case, we would be moving the physical part, what I would consider the physical necessity to have a mind. We'd be moving the brain. If we were able to keep the brain, not do any surgery on the brains, but strictly move the soul back and forth or the consciousness back and forth without any physical manipulation to the body, I think that would be an indication.
Well, sure, but say that the way that the soul is paired is, to some part in the brain, right? Descartes famously thought it was the pituitary gland, right? But however you want to, splice up the metaphysics of it, say it's paired to the brain in some particular way, right? Then it's not necessarily going to be surprising that you would have to, move the physical source of where sort of the interaction takes place between two different minds. For example, if you were able to split a brain in two, right? Transplant one half of that brain into one person, one half into another. I don't think it's necessarily going to be clear which one is going to be the original person. So again, this would be one reason that indicates to me that you're not going to, it could be paired to a physical location, but it's not going to be identical to the physical matter itself.
Yeah, and maybe the last thing I'll say about that is if consciousness is paired to a physical part of the brain, and the only way to separate consciousness from a human body is to take a physical part of the brain out of the body, to me, that would still indicate that consciousness cannot exist without some sort of physical attachment. So consciousness is a manifestation of the physical.
Well, that's actually compatible with substance dualism, though, right? William Hasker, for example, he's a substance dualist, but his version of substance dualism is called emergent dualism. So he thinks that consciousness is an immaterial thing, but it is emergent from sort of the physical properties of the brain that have to be arranged in a particular sort of way. So on his version of substance dualism, you would have to have a sort of physical basis that is going to generate the immaterial mind. So substance dualism doesn't necessarily entail that you can have minds that exist apart from bodies. There are certain versions where you actually do have to have a particular physical configuration in order to get a soul in the first place.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's all I really have to say to that. Yeah, I'm just, we probably won't be able to come to an agreement on mind-body dualism. But the other piece of evidence you brought up for God's existence is the contingency argument, which was first or popularized by Thomas Aquinas. I'm not sure if you're appealing to a version that's relatively similar to his. But my understanding, just to make sure that I'm on the same page as you with contingency, is that the continued existence, or everything that's in existence, is contingent on something else for its continued existence. So if object A is contingent on B, B is on C, at some point we have to have a necessary agent upon which all other things are contingent. Otherwise, we find ourselves in an infinite regression, which is uncomfortable for a lot of people. Is that kind of am I on the right track with the way you describe the contingency argument?
Pretty similar. It looks like my computer internet is back. Can I try joining through my computer and maybe drop it on my phone? All right.
Yeah, for sure. There we go. All right.
Now I'm trying to exit.
I closed out of the other window, so you could just mute your phone. I think we should be good to go.
Okay. All right.
Perfect.
Yeah. Sorry about that. I have no idea what's going on with my internet there, but it says my signal's strong now. So yeah, basically contingency argument is you'll say there are contingent things, and then contingency means dependent on something. We don't want an infinite regress of contingent things depending on other contingent things. So you need some necessary thing to terminate the regress. And then basically the second stage is to argue that God is the best explanation for what that necessary thing would be.
Yeah, there's two different responses I've heard to this argument, which I think are both pretty strong. One of them is the rock, paper, scissors argument, which is that contingency doesn't necessarily have to be a linear regression. So we could have object A is contingent on B, B is contingent on C, but C is contingent on A. So we have a series of things which are all contingent upon each other, and there doesn't need to be one necessary thing, because everything which is contingent is just contingent on some other thing. So it's a loop rather than a regressive line.
Yeah. Then there's I guess be circularity worries about that, is that you've got sort of nothing that's ultimately explaining things, but you've got kind of this interdependence of various things on each other. I know there are objections against the idea that you can have circular explanations of that kind. But again, as I said, this argument is not necessarily the one that I go to the most. I just suspect that there's probably a way to make it work. All I could really say off the top of my head to sort of circular explanations is that they seem really unsatisfying to me. It seems like you can't, it just seems like you can't explain something that's, depending on itself, because ultimately you're saying that the thing explains itself in some way.
Yeah. I think that there may be a distinction we have to make between a circular argument and a circular dependency. And I don't think that circular dependency is necessarily the same as a circular argument, where we're not necessarily proving something with the same thing, but rather
you're explaining it with the same
right.
thing.
We're just recognizing that everything relies on each other for existence, and there is no ultimate being at the heart of everything.
Yeah. One thing I think you could say is that there's probably empirical examples that just clearly aren't going to fit that sort of explanation. So, like, for example, like my physical body, right? It's contingent on, right, my parents, and theirs are contingent on their parents, and so on. And so, like, clearly that's going to be a linear chain, right? There's no sense in which I'm explaining myself. I mean, maybe you could try to argue, this is something I'd have to think about further, but maybe you could argue that there's a way in the sense in which the matter that comprises my body actually is at some level responsible for it, all sort of coming together again at this later point in time. But I guess on its face, it looks like there are some clear examples of linear change of dependency.
Yeah, and there's sort of, you brought up two different methods of causation we could use to explain you. One of them is your parents, having you through reproduction, and then that creates a linear progression towards an abiogenesis event. But then the other explanation, which I think might be more interesting, is that you're dependent on matter, and that your parents and now you are just in a constant state of taking matter from basically food in the sun and turning it into a person. So you, through just your body's own processes, are transforming the world around you into yourself. And so the matter that creates you, the matter and energy that creates you, exists and has existed as potentially other people and other life forms before you existed. But
Yeah,
then
yeah.
either way, we still have to trace all the matter and energy of the universe back to a singularity. And then behind or before that, if before is even a coherent thought, before the Big Bang, I have no idea. I don't think anyone has any idea either what happened before or if there was a before. One popular, well, I don't know how popular it is, but my favorite explanation for the origin of the universe or the origin of the Big Bang is that time itself is not infinitely regressed. But if we were to rewind the clock, eventually our clock just wouldn't be able to rewind any further. It would just stop because time itself began with the existence of a singularity. Like the singularity is just already right there at t equals 0. And so there was never anything that caused time to start because there was never a before when time was started.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of getting us into cosmological arguments there. Typically, I guess the objection there, from people who defend cosmological arguments, and again, I'm not necessarily throwing my weight behind these, but I guess they are like all the premise or all the work is going to be done by premises saying that whatever begins to exist has a cause or something like that. Appeals to principle of sufficient reason. And I mean, there's arguments for those and against those. I haven't done the requisite spade work to have a firm opinion on it. Something about that seems intuitively right to me, that whatever begins to exist has a cause. But at the same time, like, I can conceive of something like coming into existence without a cause. There's not like a logical contradiction in that. So as like implausible as that seems to me, I also like can't say I have a knockdown argument against that either.
Yeah, and I think I would, you brought up the Kalam cosmological argument, but I think my biggest objection to that argument would actually be the second premise, where the universe began to exist. In my scenario, where if we can't ever find a before time, the universe has existed for all time. So there was never a point where the universe didn't exist, and therefore it didn't really begin. It's existed for all of time.
Yeah,
But then,
I mean, you wouldn't.
go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I think the argument there is going to be, well, so some people make a distinction between, I think it's like time and meta-time or something like that. Getting into philosophy of time here, which is another area that I don't specialize in.
Me neither.
Yeah, but I'm sorry. What was the point you were raising there? I forgot what I was even responding
Oh, it
to.
was how I'm not convinced the universe began to exist.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think most of the work there, because I mean, obviously the scientific evidence is going to be. I mean, empirical arguments are always going to be inconclusive. Obviously.
You're breaking up a little bit, Dave. Just repeat everything you said after. Empirical arguments are going to be.
Empirical arguments are going to be inherently uncertain. And so I think people like William Lane Craig probably overstate the case for the scientific case for the beginning of a universe. He does have like another line of argument for a finite past, which is, like his Hilbert's Hotel argument and sort of these purely philosophical arguments. But again, I have concerns with these too, because they don't like actually get you to a logical contradiction in having an infinite past. So this is why I'm a little iffy on the Kalam cosmological argument, because one, I think William Lane Craig kind of oversells it and he doesn't necessarily let people know how controversial some of the premises and there are. And then even the arguments that he gives for some of these premises, they're like not as clearly refuting the idea that the past is eternal as perhaps he makes them sound.
Sure. And then, the other response to the contingency argument I would have is kind of right in line with this, which is that I don't necessarily see an issue with an infinite regression. So if the universe is truly eternal and has existed in the past forever and ever, I don't see where that's a problem. Maybe matter and energy have always existed in some form, but just prior to the Big Bang or the Planck time, we have no method of investigating what kind of form the universe took.
Yeah, so I mean, certain versions of the contingency argument they're fine with the universe having always existed, right? There's a difference between being eternal and being necessary. So a contingency argument, like Leibniz's contingency argument, for example, is not, necessarily predicated on the idea that the universe is not eternal. He would just say that you still need an explanation for it. That you need something that's necessary, and he would argue basically that God is the best explanation for what's necessary. Not necessarily endorsing Leibniz's contingency argument, just pointing out that they don't necessarily depend on the idea that the universe is not past eternal.
Sure, and I think that the first cause argument and the contingency argument, to me, almost seem like the same argument, but they just have one word swapped out, and it almost seems like a distinction without much of a difference.
Yeah, I mean, I've always understood first cause arguments to be a type of contingency argument. In fact, really just about every argument except the ontological argument is like a type of contingency argument. Even in a way, my resurrection argument is a type of contingency argument. But yeah, I was alluding when I said that I thought there was something to a contingency argument. I was thinking more of like the Leibniz version.
Sure. Yeah, and a lot of the issues I have with the contingency, first cause, a lot of these Aquinas arguments is that it seems like Aquinas is creating a problem in infinite regression and then inventing a solution. He's saying we can't have, or I'm uncomfortable with the implications of an infinite regression. I don't like it. Therefore, I'm going to invent a God which serves as a solution for it.
Well, I mean, I'm not sure it's inventing a problem, right? I mean, there are legitimate concerns about, the coherence of infinite chains of events or causes or things like that. I'm not sure any of them are decisive, right? Because obviously there's brilliant people on both sides of this who argue that, like, no, these lead to, irreconcilable logical paradoxes. People who's like, well, no, I think there's solutions to those. This is why this kind of gets outside of my pay grade. But I don't think it's just a case of, saying, well, I'm going to invent the problem. I think it's going to be based on these broader considerations that there are reasons for thinking that there's something paradoxical or problematic about positing an actual infinity of things.
Yeah, that's fair enough. So one of my followers requested that I ask you, do you think gorillas go to heaven?
No, I don't.
Okay. So then I also take it to mean you also don't think all dogs go to heaven.
You know what? Maybe I have to rethink my theology there. No, it's funny you bring that up, actually. I was just, my wife had never seen those movies. I was just showing them to her. But yes, returning to the point, no, I don't think the dogs go to heaven.
Now, that might be an interesting route to go down. So, since you are not a young earth creationist, I'm assuming that you accept the consensus amongst biologists, which is that we are the result of evolutionary change over millions of years, and you also believe that humans have souls who go to heaven, but animals like gorillas don't. So at what point during the evolution of humans were we granted souls?
So let me give two answers. One based on what you said, it would be, I don't necessarily know at what point, presumably at whatever point God felt that we were evolved to a sufficient level of complexity to be imbibed with, an immortal soul or something like that. Returning to the previous point, and now I'm going to sound like the fundamentalist, but I am not actually fully persuaded of, the theory of evolution, common descent. Now, when I came out of young Earth creationism, I initially was an old Earth creationist, and an intelligent design proponent. If you really pressed me, that's probably where I would still find myself. But I've gotten to the place where I realize I don't understand the issues well enough to have a really informed opinion either way. So I can't confidently say to you yeah, I know that evolution is false. I think there are some legitimate concerns about the neo-Darwinian synthesis, but obviously, we've got extended evolutionary synthesis and all sorts of new various mechanisms that have been posited for things to basically for biological change to occur. I don't claim to be familiar with all of them enough to know that they are false. Ultimately, evolutionary biology, I just recognize that's kind of not my field. If it turned out to be true, I'd be fine with that. But ultimately, I'm also not. I don't know it well enough to say that I am convinced that it is true, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Right now, what would you say you're convinced of is the explanation for humans? Did God make fully formed humans, or did we, do you think that we did evolve from other apes? Where do you stand on that particular issue?
Yeah. So what I'd say is I'm not confident either way. But if you really pushed me, I would tend to believe that we were created in our present form. But at the same time, I recognize that there are certainly challenges to that, and I don't profess to be well versed enough in the paleoanthropological literature to go head to head with you. I saw you had your debate with made by Jim Bob on this, for example. So I know you're probably more up on this than I am. There was a book I read by Christopher Roop and Joan Sanford called Bones of Contention, where basically they argued that you could understand all the paleoanthropological evidence without believing in common descent. I saw Guts Gibbon did a video responding to that, and I just kind of got to the point where I was like, this is obviously a lot more technical. This is not really my field of interest. I think Christianity can still be true, even if you accept, the full evolutionary story. So I guess it became a topic that I just sort of lost interest in, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And that's fair. And I certainly won't press you on issues that you're not prepared to defend. I personally find biology and evolution extremely fascinating. And whether we are descended from other apes or if we were magically created by a god in our present form, I think would be an incredibly fascinating topic and one definitely worthy of a lot of investigation. One thing I would, point out is that within the fossil record, we find hominids that look, much like us, dating back to about 300,000 years. And then progressively back further and further, we find more and more ape-like humans or hominids, where we get Australopithecus and Homo erectus, all these other skeletons, all these other fossil remains of humans that present a very clear lineage and an evolution of phenotypic change dating from current modern humans all the way back to our common ancestor with chimpanzees. We see the same thing with chimpanzee fossils. We can trace their ancestral lineage back to the same point. And we also find between ourselves and chimps, you've probably heard of the fusion of chromosome 2. You're probably familiar with that, where humans have a chromosome that appears as though it's a fusion of two chromosomes we find in modern day chimpanzees. And then the theory, of course, is that chromosome fused over time, which is one of the major biological differences between us and them. So, all that to say, I think that the evidence for our evolution is overwhelming.
Yeah, as I said, this is not my field. I can hit you with, the rebuttals that I have heard to those arguments, and probably I won't be able to pursue it well beyond that if you have responses to these points. But what I had read from so people like Rupin Sanford and Casey Luskin from Discovery Institute was that basically, as far as the hominid transitions goes, basically at the most critical junctures in the transition tends to be where the paleoanthropological, like fossil evidence, is the most patchy. And so kind of there's a lot of interpretation that goes in there. Certain like bones in certain categories have to get like constantly recategorized. And so basically at the most critical junctures of the hominid transition, that's kind of where the evidence is the most patchy. Again, I don't claim to be super familiar with it, but that is what I've read. And then as far as human chromosome 2, this argument, I've never really understood why this one's supposed to indicate common descent, because it would seem like you could explain this equally well even if there were no common ancestry, and just say that there was a fusion event that happened within human beings that became sort of solidified in the population. Say it happened early on, and I don't necessarily see the need for common descent to explain the fusion of human chromosome 2. But yeah, I'll let you take it away with however you want to address those points.
Sure. And, I don't necessarily want to hold your feet to the fire, but I would be curious to know where exactly the patchy spots in our fossil record are. Because my understanding is that human evolution is one of the best documented lineages in all of biology. So we have more fossils of human and hominid remains than we have of almost any other organism. And then the other thing you mentioned was the chromosome 2 could have potentially fused within just human lineage, which to me would also indicate that, and presumably you do believe in some evolution, where evolution does happen within a kind, where that you acknowledge that dogs probably share a common ancestor with wolves, that dogs are the descendants of wolves, and a lot of these animals exist within a certain kind, like humans are all the same kind, and we do undergo changes in our population, like how our ability to digest lactose, for example, is a mutation that didn't exist 2,000 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. So there's plenty of evidence for what a lot of creationists would consider microevolution that I'm assuming you're probably happy to accept too.
Yeah, I'm happy with that. Where I would have more skepticism would be about the idea that sort of like all organisms go back to a single or very few common ancestors. But obviously, I think that all breeds of dogs probably go back to one or very few common ancestors, and so on and so forth.
Now, another related question I have about this particular topic: if humans were created by God, and I made a video about the creation of humankind in the Genesis story, and I don't know to what degree you think that that's literal, but do you think that God first created Adam and Eve, and then they're the ancestors of all current people, or did he make a population of humans first, and then Adam and Eve were separate creations? Or, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, when I was, a more hardcore old Earth creationist, that would have been my belief, was that Adam and Eve were the original couple from which all human beings descended.
Is that still your position now, or are you more agnostic?
I mean, if you really pushed me, that's probably where I would still land. But I obviously don't hold that with the same degree of confidence anymore. To the same, like, it's not something I would be willing to defend in a debate. But
sure.
Where do I kind of personally land? Probably that's where I'd be most comfortable. Yeah.
Yeah, and I bring it up because I think the implications that God, and this isn't something that you said you believe in, so I'd just be curious to hear your response to it, and nonetheless. But a lot of Christians who do believe God created a small population of humans separate or before Adam and Eve, because this is actually a pretty popular claim amongst Christians. The implication of that to me is that these other humans, since they never ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they didn't have the knowledge of good and evil. So then, a couple hundred years later, when God gets mad that everyone's being evil and they're corrupted with sin, so he floods the whole world, he's wholly unjustified in doing so, because none of these people know right from wrong. And he should know better than to blame them for doing evil things when they don't know what evil even is.
Yeah, I guess that'd be an interesting objection to float for people who hold to that theory. I guess I think they could probably have a way out and say that, like, maybe the pre-Adamic race had died out by the time of the flood, and that it was, strictly descendants of Adam and Eve were like the sole hominids at that time. I mean, I don't know if that's viable. That's just sort of the option that comes to mind. Like, if I held to that theory, that might be the route I would try to go down.
Yeah, and that might work only if we assume that all of Adam and Eve's children only bred with each other, or that Noah and all of his family were the descendants of strictly Adam and Eve's incest, and that none of them bred with any of the other people. Like, a lot of people cite this as a response to, where did Cain find his wife? Cain moved away from his parents and he found a wife in another town, but where the heck did this town come from? But I believe that Noah is a descendant of Seth, who is Adam's other son besides Cain, if I'm not mistaken. But then that also assumes that Seth married his own sister too. So,
yeah, I mean, that's certainly an implication of the position that all people came from Adam and Eve.
What are your thoughts on Noah's Ark? Do you think that that's literal history?
That's again going to be another one like the whole origins issue that is I don't have strong opinions on. Where I lean on that would be towards the position of somebody like John Walton, who argues that the language used in the text is literal. Well, it's not literal. It does describe a global flood, but that it's sort of hyperbolic. So that it was in fact a localized flood that sort of annihilated people, with the exception of Noah and his family, but wasn't literally all over the earth, despite that being the sort of language that's used there. I read his book on it. That seemed like a reasonable explanation to me when I read it. But again, I don't claim to have read all the ins and outs here. So, I mean, there could be problems with that I'm not aware of, but that's probably where I'd lean.
Yeah, and I think I would be happy to accept that a local flood in Mesopotamia is what inspired the Noah's Ark story in the first place, along with a lot of the other flood myths we get from the same time, like the Epic of Gilgamesh. But I see really no reason to believe that any man survived on a wooden boat for a year with, even if it wasn't, every animal in existence like penguins, even a handful of animals. I think just the idea that some guy survived a flood on a boat, I find that particular part of the story one of the more fanciful elements that I would categorize in the same unlikely category as the worldwide flood.
Yeah, I mean, if I were assessing it, on its own, that's probably I'd probably reach something of a similar conclusion. Obviously, the way the channeling works for me is I think we've got good evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, and Jesus endorses that the Old Testament is divinely inspired in some sense. So, then I have to figure out what to do with it from there. So, I'm pretty open on that. I don't have a lot of firm opinions there, but again, the reason I'm accepting it in the first place is because I think I have prior evidence for believing in Jesus. So that's kind of where I really make my bread and butter in this area. And so I'm not as concerned about, what exactly to do with the story of Noah. If I didn't have that going for me in the first place, I would probably also view it as, pretty implausible the way that you do.
Sure. Yeah. And I definitely spend more of my time and mental energy thinking about and pondering a lot of these Old Testament stories more so than the New Testament, largely because I find them so much more outlandish. Like the flood narrative it's crazy, and I think, from your own admission, the idea of a worldwide flood is preposterous and contradicted by pretty much all of the evidence we have here in the natural world. So, the idea that the entire Bible is the literal inerrant word of God, we both agree is, not the case. But it seems like you have a much more moderate perspective of Christianity where, all the Bible is inspired by real events, but the actual fact of what happened may be much different than what's described in the book, and that God didn't necessarily have a direct hand in making sure every single word matched literal history.
I think I would put it a little differently than that. So I do think that, God inspires the entire Bible, but that the Bible is just not always meant to be read in a literal way, right? And so the way we determine when it is and when it isn't is more or less by sort of assessing the genre of the particular text in question, right? So the Gospels, for example, present themselves as, straightforward historical narrative. We have indications, for example, in the prologue of Luke, right? That's exactly what they're intended to be. So I read them accordingly, whereas, Psalms and Proverbs are, this is wisdom literature. It's not all meant to be read straightforward, literally. There are, tougher cases like the book of Job. It is a poetic book, but is it also like poetic of history? I'm not as sure, right? I don't really know where to fall with the book of Job. When we're dealing with, and well, I know this is a topic that you like to discuss, so maybe I'll just give my views on it here, would be the conquest narratives, for example, in, Joshua. I view these as ancient Near Eastern war literature, right, which are employing the sort of extensive hyperbole which characterized texts of that time, right? So that's one reason why I don't feel compelled to say that God in the Old Testament is actually commanding the deaths of non-combatants like women and infants, because I think they're employing the sort of war rhetoric that characterized that time. When we get to Genesis, we're dealing with the genre of mytho-history, right? Where exactly the line is between myth and history, I'm a little gray on. And again, it's probably just from the fact that I don't find that aspect of, the Bible as interesting as some of the other ones. So I tried to have some knowledge of it. And, I've presented here sort of, where I tend to lean on those issues. But I'm perfectly happy if those aren't meant to be read straightforwardly, literally. That's not going to affect my faith really in any way.
Sure. And I think that your response to, say, the Joshua, the Deuteronomy conquest is the best response a Christian can possibly have. And I bring these up so much in my videos because they're so clearly an example of immorality in the Bible. If we were to accept, the claims of people who promote inerrancy, where God is, every single word in the entire Bible is literal history, and there's no, that nothing is meant to be taken not at face value, then I think we're forced to acknowledge that this God character is a moral monster because he's commanding the slaughter of innocent, like you said, non-combatants. But I think that your response is the best one anyone can possibly have, which is that the people who wrote the Bible were not accurately dictating what God said and did, but rather they were claiming that God commanded them to slaughter children and women to make themselves feel better, essentially, as a justification for themselves. They, in case anyone else was like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be killing these children, the Israelites, whoever was in charge, could say, don't worry, God said to do it, so we're justified in doing so.
I think my view is a little bit different. I don't think the slaughter of the non-combatants actually happens at all, right? I think that that's just sort of, it's in the genre, right? To say that they completely, annihilated these people, even though they didn't, right? That's the way that war literature of the time is written. The analogy is sometimes given in, maybe modern sports, right? To say that one team slaughtered the other one, right?
Sure.
It's not exactly like that, but it's characteristic of the war text of this time to sort of say, to exaggerate, in other words, the scale of the slaughter of these people.
I was going to just clarify on your perspective. It's the author exaggerating what God told them. So you think it's a misquote when Deuteronomy 20:16 says, God commanded them to completely destroy the Canaanites and slaughter everything that breeds. You would say the author is misquoting God.
Not even that necessarily. I'm even fine with God giving the commands as they stand, so long as they're just interpreted as being part of, this broader background of hyper exaggerated war rhetoric.
So you're saying that God did, or at least you're fine with the idea that God did command the slaughter of everyone. He said completely destroy them,
Sure.
but but the Israelites are just supposed to assume that God doesn't mean what he's saying.
Yeah, I would say that part of their background knowledge is that this sort of language is hyperbole, sort of in the same way that, if you're, the coach of a team and you tell them to, get out there and slaughter the other team, they're understanding that you don't actually mean that you're going to like be chopping the other people's heads off, right? They are understanding that you yourself are using hyperbole. So my argument would be that that was just understood in the background knowledge of the Israelites, that these commands were just not supposed to be literally followed in the first place, and that God is accommodating his message to the, literary understanding of the people at that time, who had in their background knowledge that this sort of war rhetoric is highly exaggerated and such. That's basically the approach that I would take to the total kill language.
Yeah, I think I just would take an issue with the idea that God uses wild hyperbole in direct commands he gives to people. Like God is telling them he's saying to kill babies, but he doesn't actually mean it. But this is also a God who has in the past killed babies and commanded, I mean, he's commanding the slaughter of some people, but he's just assuming that they know not to kill babies, even though he himself has killed babies. And then of course, you're familiar with Numbers 31 when the Israelites do a conquest on the Midianites, but then Moses is mad because he's like, why did you guys spare all of these children? We need to go back and kill all the boys. But then, of course, we can take the young virgin girls as prisoners of war. And then God is silent on the matter. He has no objections. So it doesn't, to me, seem uncharacteristic of God based on his previous actions that he would command the slaughter of babies and children.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the counter example I typically hear is, I think it's first or second Samuel chapter 15. But I mean, we don't have to get into that here. Yeah. I guess I'm not sure. So what would be an example of God killing, or ordering the killing of children? Would you say that, are you appealing to like the death of the firstborn in Egypt, or,
Well, if we're taking a situation where God himself kills children, then yeah, the death of the firstborn in Egypt is a great example. God drowning children and babies in a worldwide flood, even though he says everyone was, I mean, I know that you don't think that there was a worldwide flood, but even if it was local, presumably there were still babies and young people and innocent people who drowned in the flood. So we have God killing babies and young people. God sends venomous snakes to kill the Israelites when they complain about being hungry. He opens up the earth and then people fall in and die. So, I mean, he's definitely no rookie to killing people. And he's also a big fan of collective punishment, generational punishment. So yeah, to me, doesn't seem uncharacteristic of God to command the slaughter of children like he does in, say, Deuteronomy 20:16.
and can you remind me what Deuteronomy 20:16 says?
Yeah, it's the basically God is commanding the complete annihilation of 6 different tribes: the Canaanites and
Oh,
Hivites,
right,
Hittites, and a
right,
few
right.
others. And that's where he says, "Leave alive nothing that breathes."
So yeah, that would be where I would be saying, okay, that would be war rhetoric.
And after he says that, he also goes on. God goes on to say, "Spare all the fruit trees, because those you can use for yourself." And the fact that God went out of his way to say, "Spare trees," seems to me like an indication that everything that's not a fruit tree, animals, livestock, babies, children, pregnant women, all of these things were, good to kill.
Yeah. Okay. So good. So here's roughly how I take these things on, right? For the killing of the firstborn, right? I take Michael Heiser's view on this, that this is not talking about like literally every firstborn person, but what the title "the firstborn" refers to is specifically to like the one who's supposed to inherit the lands of like the Egyptian fathers, so the people who basically currently own the lands. So this isn't necessarily picking out like infants and children. It's picking out basically the person who's going to inherit it. So I don't think we have to have killing of children there.
Couldn't some of the people that are destined to inherit land be children?
Well, I mean, possibly. We don't, necessarily know that for sure. Heiser, and it's been a minute since I studied this. Heiser argues that it would not have been, if I understand him correctly, that the person who's like directly in line to inherit is not going to be the child, at least until the child comes to like a certain age. So there'd be like I'm trying to think of the exact word, but like a guardian of the child who is like directly in line to inherit until the child comes of age. And so they're going to be considered like positionally firstborn son until then. Again, this is just Heiser's argument. It tends to be the one that I follow. So I don't think you have to say that God is killing children in ancient Egypt. As for, opening up the ground and swallowing people.
Before we move on from Egypt, the response I might have to that is that even if I were to accept that God's not killing children, I would say that he's still unjustified in killing adults who are not responsible for the containment of the Israelites. In that situation, it's ultimately Pharaoh who is refusing to let the Israelites go because God is violating his free will and preventing him from doing so. But the only person, even if that's not the case, even if you reject the violation of Pharaoh's free will, it's still Pharaoh who is the problem. He's the one who is keeping the Israelites. If God just killed Pharaoh or even violated his free will the other way and just compelled him to let the Israelites go, the problem would have been solved and no one would have needed to die.
Let's put a pin in that. We can come back to that just real quick to understand why I'm not thinking that God is actually killing infants. Having the snakes, for example, I don't think that the passage requires us to say that any children were affected by this. Presumably, if these snakes are being sent by God, then God will direct them to the people, in this case, who have been disobedient to him. Similar explanation I would give when, Korah and his people are swallowed up in the earth. I don't think we have to say that any infants are swallowed. The hardest case is going to be the flood in the Old Testament. I would agree with that. I'll give you my own theory about what I think is going on there. And this is not one that I can claim to be able to back up from the text, but just because of broader beliefs that I have, like largely based on teachings in the New Testament about God. I can't bring myself to think that God is just willy-nilly going to kill innocents like that. So my own idea is that perhaps something like a mini rapture event happens, right? Where God takes the children out directly to heaven and that they are actually not killed in the flood. Again, I don't claim to be able to back that one up from the text, but just kind of personally, that's my best hunch as to what happened with the flood. But I acknowledge that's a very, very tough one to get around for my position, as made obvious by the case that, I have to appeal to something like that to preserve the view.
And it also requires total speculation on your part, which contradicts things directly said in the text, like that every single person's heart was fully corrupted by evil all the time, which presumably included babies because they're in the subgroup of every person, every human.
Well, now that's an interesting case, right? Because Noah is also said to be in that category. It would also be in that, right? Because Noah is also one of the creatures, right? And yet the text turns right around and says that Noah is a just man, right? So he's not in that category, and presumably neither are his sons or their wives or Noah's wife. So I think that that's just another indication that we are dealing with hyperbole in that text as well. But as long as we're speculating about God and what he did surrounding the flood, if God was willing and if he did rapture all the innocent babies from the earth before flooding it, why didn't he just do the opposite, where he just took all the evil people and made them disappear, or just moved them straight to hell supernaturally? What was the point of the flood in the first place? It was just a total waste of time. Not to mention all the animals who died, who presumably didn't get the privilege of going to heaven. So God could have just made all the evil people disappear with the Thanos snap of a finger, but instead he insisted on this very outlandish and crazy
crazy natural disaster where he could have just done a really quick and easy supernatural intervenence with reality in order to remove all the evil people.
Sure, but if we're presuming that the innocents are primarily going to be like newborns and children, right? If he'd left them and then killed off the adults, then it's going to be a bit of a tall order for Noah and his and his sons and their wives to take care of all of those innocents. So I mean, I suppose that would be one reason I could think of off the bat why God would not do it in reverse. As for the animals, I mean, this might not. I'm not sure how you feel about this issue, so this might get me in hot water with some people. But I'm not as concerned about animals, and I don't see
Just kidding.
I don't see a biblical reason to think that God is either. So to some extent, that one just doesn't concern me as much. That a bunch of innocent animals were drowned.
Well, I would certainly concede that the Bible definitely does not put much, if any, value on animal life. I made a whole video about how the animal promotes animal cruelty. How did I say the animal? The Bible promotes animal cruelty, where God gives humans total dominion over the animals. He basically thinks it's okay for us to exploit them in any way and treat them however we want. And their death is completely meaningless and arbitrary, like in the flood or when Jesus sends 2,000 pigs off a cliff to drown to death. I mean, God has no regard for animal life whatsoever. So I think that you are correct in your assessment of the Bible's view on animals. But regarding whether God could do the inverse and just snap people to hell, he could have done both. He could have brought all the babies to heaven and sent all the evil people to hell, and then just spared the world of the flood.
I mean, I suppose so, but is there like any? I guess what would be the reason to do that? Like to not have the flood, because it doesn't seem like there's any like cataclysmic like results for the earth from having this.
Well, the reason I don't think there's any cataclysmic results is because I don't think the flood actually happened. If it did, I think if there was really a global flood, there would be cataclysmic impacts on the earth. Like, for example, where would all the water have gone after the earth was flooded? Would it just sink into the earth's core? Would it move up into space? Where was the water before the flood? Not to mention the destruction the flood would do to the earth and destroying all the land-dwelling plants, the food afterwards. All the animal populations we do have would be reduced to incest. But I don't want to get too far removed from the killing of babies.
And also just recall that I lean towards a local flood myself.
Right, exactly, sure. But getting back to infanticide, if we move past the flood, I think the next example I brought up was you mentioned 1 Samuel 15:3, where it says to kill all the men, women, children, cattle, donkeys. Now, I used to cite that one a lot, and then I stopped because someone pointed out that in that particular example, it may not be, or I think within the text, it's not a direct quote from God, but rather it's Samuel recalling a quote from God or claiming that he was Samuel speaking on behalf of God. So that one I've generally stay away from, and I lean more towards Deuteronomy 20 or like Numbers 31, where God is commanding these conquests.
I think a way you could still use 1 Samuel 15 for the way that I think you would want to would be that Samuel does, quote God as saying this, but then, God seems to approve of that because he does then go on to, remove Saul from being king, right? He rejects him. His blessing is no longer on him, and he ultimately does replace him with David. So, I mean, I think you could probably argue that Samuel's interpretation of what God is saying is probably accurate there. Again, for me, I'm just going to go back to that. I think that this is talking about hyperbole, though, is how I would get around that. But I think for the purposes you want to, you actually probably could still leverage that to use 1 Samuel 15.
Sure, and that same argument that you proposed, I could also use towards Judges 11, where I think it's Judges 11, where Jephthah sacrifices his daughter to God, in exchange for God helping Jephthah win a war. So God interferes with the war, rigs it in Jephthah's favor, and then Jephthah has to hold up his end of the bargain by killing his daughter And then God is silent on the matter. He doesn't object, but he doesn't strictly say, yes, go ahead and kill her. He's just totally silent. There's no interference like there is with Abraham and Isaac. But later on, you'll have to forgive me, I can't remember the passage. It might be Hebrews, but there was another, I think it was a New Testament passage where it mentioned Jephthah in a list of godly prophets. Like, oh, here's a list of people they're just really great guys. And so if we were to accept that Jephthah's a great guy and a God-fearing man, and then it would stand to reason that he was not unjustified or not disobeying God or doing anything God didn't like when he sacrificed his daughter to him.
Yeah, I guess 2 points to raise about that. So as far as the passage in the New Testament, it could, maybe perhaps not be with reference to him specifically killing his daughter, but rather with him, keeping his promise to God, which would be to sacrifice the first thing that came out to greet him, which, just so happened to be his daughter. But and I'm not sure of the particular context, but if it's in Hebrews, then it's probably, holding him up as an example of faith. So what it's drawing our attention to, I would say, is more likely the fact that he was trusting God in the first place to, rig things in his favor. The other point to raise about this is that I have heard that the text implies that Jephthah did not actually kill his daughter, and instead that she became, I forget what the exact term is, but it'd be something like a nun, right? Someone who gives up, having sexual intercourse with people, and that she's sort of completely dedicated to the service of God. And I believe this is supposed to be implied by the statement in there that she wanted to mourn her virginity or something like that in the text. I don't know that that's, I'm not an Old Testament guy. So, I mean, whether that's actually defensible, I couldn't tell you, but that is something that I have heard floated out there by some biblical scholars.
Yeah, and I've heard the same. I've heard the same response to the Jephthah story that she became a nun and she was celibate. But yeah, to me that seems like a very obvious post hoc rationalization from people that hate to admit that God would ever be okay with a human sacrifice. And so it's a direct change to the story based on our distaste with the implications it gives God's character. And the text really makes no indication that Jephthah's daughter became a celibate nun. It calls it a burnt offering, which Leviticus 1 and I think 4 go into pretty great detail about what a burnt offering entails. You have to cut off the limbs and rip out the intestines and set the whole corpse on fire. And who knows if Jephthah was responsible for ripping his own daughter's intestines out or if he had someone else do it for him. Who's to say? Or if he followed the exact guidelines for a burnt offering to a T, or maybe he just slit her throat and lit her on fire. Who knows? But it also is curious to me why his daughter would need to mourn her virginity if she had all the time in the world to mourn her virginity once she became a nun. So what's the point of taking 2 months to do so? To me, it seems obvious that it's 2 months, her last 2 months to live, mourning her virginity, or at least mourning the fact that she'll never be able to mother any children. Because surely in those 2 months she could have just messed around with someone out on her own, and who's to say? But the author does explicitly say at the point of the burnt offering, when it says that Jephthah sacrificed his daughter, it says that at that time she was a virgin, which the only way that the author could possibly know that is divine intervention, because how would the author possibly know that she didn't fool around on her own?
Yeah, those are interesting points. Again, I don't claim to have done a deep dive on that particular text. That was just something that I'd heard. But I think those are certainly fair points to raise in response to the idea that, she became whatever the Old Testament equivalent of a nun is.
Yeah. And I think, getting back to the whole God using hyperbole when he's commanding the slaughter of people, I think that to me, it seems very outlandish that God would command such horrible events with just the assumption that everyone understands what he's talking about. And then that also puts into question everything God says. Because if God is willing to, for lack of a better phrase, joke around about killing babies, who's to say any of his commandments are to be taken seriously?
Yeah, I don't think it's joking around. I think it's phrasing things in the terminology of the people at the time, right? Like, so to go back to sort of the example that I gave of the coach, right, telling the team to get out there and slaughter the other team. Do you think it's terrible that he would just assume that the people on the team would know that they're not supposed to be like literally slaughtering the other team, or that as opposed to just giving them a sound, beating them soundly, and essentially like, if this is the way people talked back then in the context of war rhetoric, and it was just understood, right? This is something that people just knew at that time, then I don't see what the concern is.
Well, yeah, to me, the example of a football team doesn't really seem fair, because in that context, everyone there is under under the consensus that we're playing a sports game, and no one actually wants to hurt anyone else or send anyone else to the hospital, hopefully. But when it comes to war, their goal is to kill people. They have spears and swords in their hands. They're going to this other town to slaughter people. And so if God specifically says, leave alive nothing that breathes, to me, that seems incredibly unambiguous.
Yeah, well, I would agree it's an imperfect analogy, right? I mean, ultimately, all analogies are. But the point is that the point of the comparison is that if this is what the term was understood to mean in that time, just as, slaughter in a sports context today is not understood to mean to literally slaughter the members of the other team. Or, to give another example, saying that, my car, the car was flying down the road, right? If it didn't literally have wings on it, right? If, we have these sorts of figures of speech, then there's nothing surprising about somebody using those figures of speech. So what I'm trying to do is say that same idea can be applied in the context of, an ancient Near Eastern war rhetoric. So if that's just how people talked back then, and I think there's really good evidence from, not just the Bible, but from, other ancient war literature, that that's just how people wrote about having a sound victory, was as, completely annihilating the enemy and leaving none alive, then that would have been understood by Israelite soldiers. And I think we have independent evidence that it was understood this way. If you don't mind me getting into a little bit of that, would be, so for example, the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, right? Saul supposedly like completely destroys them, right? And only leaves Agag alive. And yet the Amalekites are around again in 1 Samuel 27. So that this is being employed in a hyperbolic way is supported by the text itself, right? Because we would have these statements on the one hand that these people are completely destroyed, and then they're around again a chapter later.
Well, if I could respond to that point really quick. Okay. Another example to your point is that I believe there was passages later on after Deuteronomy where characters come in contact with like a Hittite or a Hivite woman or something. So, there's evidence within the Bible that people from these tribes did survive the genocide of the Israelites. But I don't think that in itself is an indication that God was using hyperbole, because the fact that Israel failed to carry out God's command does not necessarily mean that God's command didn't include the slaughter of children. It just means that that the Israelites failed in carrying out his orders.
But look, we're not just applying this to God's command, right? Like, I'm actually applying this to the descriptions in the text, right? The description says that Saul utterly smote the Amalekites with the edge of the sword and left none alive except for their king Agag, right? So this is not even God's command. This is how the text is written. The narrative portion of the text is saying that none of these people were left alive, with the exception of King Agag, who, Samuel ends up killing a few years later. If that's a literal description of what happened, then like there flatly are no Amalekites. And yet, again, 1 Samuel 27, the Amalekites are creating a problem again, right? King David has to go to war with them. And the Amalekites are not an isolated case. We have this all over the Old Testament of this phenomenon, which I'm saying that's evidence that supports the hyperbolic reading of certainly the narrative portions of the text. And if it supports the narrative portions of the text being hyperbolic, there's no reason that wouldn't apply to the divine commands as well. I think that's the argument I'm making.
Yeah, but I would say that the fact that Samuel describes the utter destruction of the Amalekites and then their later reappearance, that would actually be something I would consider a pretty strong contradiction, where rather than using hyperbole as a explanatory power to remove it, I would say that this is just the Bible contradicting itself and presenting a narrative in two different spots which conflict with each other. Like it's giving us two different facts which are mutually exclusive.
Yeah, well, I mean, it would be a contradiction if, you're trying to read the text literally. What I'm suggesting is that rather than say that, like, it's contradictory this often in these texts, because, I mean, presumably at least the authors, right, of 1st, 2nd Samuel, Joshua, at least they've got, a fairly consistent idea in their own mind of what's going on, right? Like, this is not a contradiction between, the book of Acts and something in 1st Samuel. I mean, these are like within the very same narratives written presumably by the same authors who are trying to tell a cohesive narrative. Like, if they're not employing hyperbole, they're really bad at this. And I mean, maybe you just want to fall back on it and be like, well, yeah, they were complete boneheads who, just contradicted themselves within a couple of chapters, saying there were no more Amalekites. To me, it seems like the more plausible interpretation, especially given, again, reviewing other ancient Near Eastern war literature of that time, is that this is just a artifact of the fact that they are using extensive war hyperbole.
Yeah, I would still lean more towards that the authors are boneheads and that they're just contradicting themselves. That's my position. And of course, with Deuteronomy, this isn't. It's the narrator is recanting God's quotation, so it would be God Himself giving hyperbolic rhetoric, and not necessarily just the author giving hyperbolic narrative. And I think that, if God is willing to be hyperbolic about who we're supposed to kill and who we're not supposed to kill, that also brings into question all the other instances where God commands like, say, the killing of homosexuals in Leviticus 20:13, or when God says, do not suffer a witch to live. You'll have to forgive me, I can't remember the citation on that one. But, are we to take these commands seriously, or were the Israelites at the time to take these commands seriously? Does God really want us? Or, if I'm to submit to covenant theology, did God really expect the Israelites to stone witches and homosexuals? Or was He just being hyperbolic? Like, did He just mean, don't actually kill them? But
yeah, it's a fair question to ask. What I think that the difference there is, and sorry, I know we're a little over the 2.5 hour mark, so you.
Yeah. We'll have to wrap it up here pretty quick. Yeah.
Yeah. But what I would say there is that the difference is that one, we don't have the sort of context of similar literature in the ancient Near East, which indicates that these sorts of commands are hyperbolic in the way that we do with total kill language in the genre of war rhetoric. So there's that. And shoot, I had another point I was going to make too, but I think it was a variation of that same point. So yeah, pretty much is that we don't have the background information indicating that these sorts of commands would be hyperbolic in the same way that we do with the war passages.
Yeah, that's fair. And I think that we'll probably have to agree to disagree about God's use of hyperbole in the Old Testament with the Israelites. But, I do have to wrap it up here because I do have to get going. But Dave, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for the very stimulating conversation. You're a lot more prepared for this kind of debate than my last opponent. So it's refreshing to talk to someone who's extremely well-versed in New Testament theology. So, and admittedly, a lot of these post New Testament texts like Justin Martyr and First Clement, I haven't read these myself. So, there's definitely an area where I can improve my own knowledge, because I've also heard that a lot of these, I mentioned this before, that a lot of these ancient post New Testament books include some magical elements as well. So, but yeah, I have more reading to do, definitely more investigation to do. I remain unconvinced that Jesus rose from the dead, but that probably won't come as any surprise to you. But Dave, thanks again so much for being here and having the conversation. Any final thoughts, or feel free to give your channel a shout out, that kind of thing?
Sure, yeah. I mean, if people are at all interested, my channel's Faith Because of Reason. And so, I post my various theological and apologetic thoughts over there. Yeah, appreciate the conversation, Jed. I like your demeanor to these things. You were also a bit better prepared on the issue of gospel authorship than I was frankly expecting. So I appreciate that you did take some time to prepare for this as well. And yeah, I mean, keep having the conversations with people, and we'll hope over here that you come over to the side of faith. But in the meantime, we'll definitely enjoy the conversation. So thanks for having me on.
Of course, my pleasure. Thanks for being here, Dave. Thanks everyone for watching, and we'll see you next time.